Chapter 351. Auspicious Air. Ancient Aura. Heavenly Enlightenment. It went by many names across just as many worlds. But, regardless of what it was called, the rarity of it didn't change at all. Even the normally calm and unflustered Era couldn't help but be shocked at this moment. It was to the point her eyes widened uncontrollably. Era raised her slender finger to her pink lips, shushing Sil. It seemed that she was afraid of waking Lionel from such a rare state. It was clear that she had no idea that Lionel had entered this state by choice, and it wasn't a mere rare chance. It was something beyond that. A few minutes later, the air around Lionel suddenly vanished and he woke up within his dream world. At that moment, he too was stunned. 3 minutes. It took 3 minutes, Lionel was shocked. Usually, it would take him a few hours to master a spear if he went all out. In truth, this was already shockingly fast. If others came to know he could do this, there was no telling what kind of sensation it would cause. However, Lionel came to realize that as he climbed the hill, the more difficult it became and the more hours he had to pour in to master these spears. Before he realized it, a few months had passed and he had only mastered 300 or so of the over 2,000 he needed to. But, this took him only 3 minutes? The most shocking part was that he had only comprehended with one mind. What if he split his mind 8 ways and reflected on the force art from 8 different directions at once? Era sighed. It only lasted a few minutes, but that would be enough for him to meditate on for a lifetime. He's quite a lucky child. Era almost choked. Lionel entered the state again. Her elegant demeanor was suddenly thrust out the window. Lionel began to experiment. Would it be more efficient to comprehend numerous spells at once? Or meditate on the same spear? What about if he spent 4 mind splits on one spear and 4 on another? What if he spent 2 on each spear? Lionel exhausted all these options. Hopping into and out of a state Era thought was nearly impossible to touch in the first place. By the end of it all, she felt so numb that she may very well have been close to losing her mind. Sil and Ree watched this scene play out from the side, completely stunned. They didn't know what had happened to their elegant and refined sister-in-law to make her act like this. In truth, Era's reactions weren't very exaggerated. To other people, they could only be considered to be a slight reaction. Maybe a slight opening of her pink lips, a slight raise of her brows, a slight twitch at the corner of her eyes and lashes. However, for Era, this was the equivalent of her jaw dropping to the floor. Of course, Lionel had no idea what these women were feeling. He wouldn't care even if he knew. After all, the force art was within his dream world, which was essentially just a projection of his memories in his mind. It was impossible for anyone to take from him. Is this his ability? Era finally concluded. When Era came to this conclusion, she sucked in a cold breath. She suddenly understood why Lionel would disdain to be a bodyguard. Though Era had already seen through Lionel's potential, it seemed that even her own evaluation was too low. Someone with such an ability wouldn't be restricted by anything. Of course, Era was technically incorrect, but also could be considered to be correct in a way as well. Without his ability, it would truly be impossible for Lionel to do what he was doing now. If this is truly the case, we have picked up a treasure. But this treasure will be difficult to control. Mistress Era regained her calm. No matter how one looked, it had become impossible to read her thoughts from her expression. So that's how things are. Lionel realized several things through countless experiments. For one, it was far more efficient to split his mind and meditate on the same spear. From Lionel's trials, for a spear at the bottom of the hill, it took about a single minute to master while meditating on the natural force art. For one nearer the middle, it took about 5 minutes. For one near the top, it took upwards of 10 minutes. However, if he meditated on a spear with 2 minds at once, the time was lowered by a factor of 3. A lower tier spear would take 20 seconds and so on. The more minds Lionel used, the efficiency became greater and greater. Eventually, when he used all 8 minds, it took him no more than a second or 2 for a lower tier spear and not even a third of a minute for a higher tier one. Still, even this wasn't the greatest realization Lionel had made. When he went back to the base of the spear peak in order to experiment with lower-tier spears, he realized that masteries could be separated into tiers. Lionel personally chose to split masteries into 2 tiers. 1, the lower, was what he called shallow mastery, while the higher was named depth mastery by him. Shallow mastery was all Lionel had grasped until now. In order to evoke this mastery, he had to recall the memories and project the image of the spear consciousness outward. This was why whenever he battled with his spear, the images of the spear owners would pop up. However, when he reached depth mastery, this evocation was no longer necessary. It became ingrained into his very bones. In order to reach depth mastery, the requirement was 10 times the time. This meant for a lower-level spear, it would take about 20 seconds. For a middle-level spear, it would around 2 minutes. For a higher-tier spear, it would take around 4 to 5 minutes. But for Lionel, this was well worth it because he realized that when he reached depth mastery, the stamina it took him to use his dreamscape battle sense plummeted. Chapter 352. Lionel lost track of the days, causing the ladies within the carriage to almost become worried. This wasn't because they were worried for Lionel, and it wasn't because they were worried about their own safety having to sleep in the same region as a man either. After all, with Mistress Era here, even if Lionel had evil thoughts, whether or not he'd be able to keep his life for more than a few seconds was the real question in such a situation. What they were really worried about was cleanliness. They were very much worried that Lionel would ruin things with his presence. And, as though this wasn't bad enough, he hadn't moved in almost a week already. But, as time passed, they began to realize something extraordinary. Despite not making any attempts to clean himself, Lionel actually didn't smell. In fact, he looked the exact same as he had when he began to meditate without a care in the world. Not only that, but he didn't even try to strike up a conversation with any one of them. It made sense for him to maintain distance from Era. After all, considering how much Syl's elder brother doted on his wife, he might very well kill Lionel just for being in her presence like this. But what about Ri and Syl? The 2 women began to feel that there was either something wrong with them or something wrong with Lionel. Lionel's eyes suddenly shot open. A piercing gaze seemed to tear through the air before him as the faint light of a spear shot into the void. Mistress Era didn't miss this subtle change. But, before she needed to act, Lionel snuffed out the aura himself. Lionel sent his gaze out of the carriage window, finding an ever-looming city quickly approaching. But, this city made the one he had landed in seem like a children's toy. Its walls were hundreds of meters tall, projecting an air of not only strength but also artistry. Lionel never thought that he'd be thinking such a thing about wall, but here he was. The walls were a gentle gold color accented by a strong crimson red. Depictions of valiant warriors and magical beasts were etched across its surface, projecting a 3-dimensional landscape of war. Just staring at the images made Lionel feel as though the clanging of weapons and the roaring of beasts were reverberating in his mind. Yet, he couldn't take his eyes off of it. He felt his blood boil, his eyes flickering on and off with a violet-red color that shrouded the carriage in an oppressive air. This feeling. It was the very same feeling he had the first time he faced an army of demons. Syl and Ri shivered, inching away from Lionel while lamenting that the massive carriage was still too small. Mistress Era's gaze trembled. She too felt her heart palpitate. She could tell that this was the first time Lionel was seeing these walls. Usually, it was impossible to become so immersed during a second or third attempt. In addition, most would miss the opportunity and look away after losing courage, not knowing they were leaving an opportunity of a lifetime behind. Era could have never expected that Lionel would not only keep looking, but he had even awoken from his meditation as though he had sensed it calling out to him. This has no business on a 4th-dimensional world. Lionel suddenly mumbled. The words were only meant for himself, but Era's eyes widened when she managed to grasp them. In the end, she smiled lightly. Though she did, with her demeanor, it was no more than the slightest curl of her lip. Lionel, you are quite patient. All this time, you haven't asked what it is you'll be participating in. Lionel blinked out of his thoughts and looked toward the future matriarch of the Kiafur family. This was the first time she had spoken with him since he entered this carriage. "I figured you'd tell me when it was time," Lionel finally replied. Era's beautiful blue eyes fluttered. Then, without responding directly to the question, she looked toward the city in the distance. "Do you know what that city represents?" "Bravery," Lionel said without hesitation. Era seemed surprised by this answer before she smiled lightly. This time, her smile seemed much more obvious than it had been in the past. "That's one answer," she said noncommittedly. "My answer, though, is even simpler than that. It's survival." Lionel's heart stilled for a moment. A flood of unknowable emotions surged through him, causing his blood to rumble once more. "You say bravery because you have the strength to say as much. To those without power, it's never about something so idealistic. All they want to see is their next day, their next meal, their next breath. It's not about anything more than that." Syl's eyes glittered as she looked toward Lionel. Is this boy really powerful enough to gain such an evaluation from her sister-in-law? As for the simplest among them all, she almost couldn't refrain from harumphing. She clearly didn't like anything that praised Lionel. What powerful man would bully a young, beautiful girl like her? More pointedly, what powerful man would have such a slave brand? Lionel didn't respond to these words. This wasn't the first time he had run into such a problem. His talk with Roaring Black Lion all those months ago still resurfaced in his memories from time to time. "You could say that this is a matter of survival for our family. So, I hope that you'll treat this with the appropriate amount of seriousness." It was only now Lionel realized that he was dealing with a mad woman. This woman knew nothing about him. Yet, she directly snubbed a genius likely hand-picked by their family in favor of him, a man branded with a mark that might as well have assigned him as a slave. If she wasn't mad, then how else would you describe it? Yet, Lionel couldn't help but find himself grinning. If he couldn't find Aina, the next best option was to raise holy hell until she caught wind of him being here. If this place was really so important, wouldn't it be perfect for him? He was beginning to think that Era might have taken a liking to him because he too was a madman. Chapter 353. That's the Kafir family's entourage. The outside of the valiant city was bustling. It was not much different from the people of Earth meeting their celebrities. To the common folk, a family that ruled of a city like Kafir's was far beyond their reach. To see them in the flesh like this was an opportunity of a lifetime. These people knew that they would never have the chance to enter Brave City. But they still traveled here from all over just to catch a glimpse of the festivities. The best part was that they could do so safely. No beasts or invalids would dare to enter even the 10-kilometer radius of Brave City. The aura around it was simply too oppressive. Thanks to this, it was often even safer to be here than it would be to stay at their homes. The Swan family escort is here. The crowd boiled once again. What could excite the people more if not rivalry and competition? Not only were the Swan and Kiafur families both long-standing enemies, but they also both had the strength to stand out amidst the crowd. Terrain had a system of cities and powers. They worked together to balance one another. While the cities were ruled by city lords, the powers were ruled by patriarchs and matriarchs. Of course, there were divisions amongst cities and within powers. But both Kafir and Swan City were both the highest Tier 9 cities. They stood at the helm of the world along with the strongest powers. If not, they would never have teleportation hubs. The warriors of the Swan and Kafir families swept glances over one another, a haughty air exuding from them all. They seemed to toe a line of acknowledgement and indifference. Both entourages came to a stop about half a kilometer from the looming city gates. Even as members of the escort, they were aware that they wouldn't be allowed to enter the city gates. Only the elites amongst the elite would be allowed to do such a thing. At that moment, the crowd became entirely focused on the carriages near the middle of the entourage and the small group of elites around it. They all knew that the group of young men and women around the center and the elites within the carriage were the only ones that would be able to take the stage. At that moment, Xyler's expression was gloomy as could be. He gripped the reins of his war horse so tightly that the imprint seeped into his skin and even became soaked with blood. Those who had gained a quota along with Xyler looked toward him with pitying gazes and couldn't help but push their hatred for Lionel up another notch. This adulation should have been Xyler's. Yet, he wouldn't even get to participate in something he had worked so hard for. How could he also not be enraged? But, in a world where power spoke over all, there was nothing he could do. Mistress Era was more powerful than he was, so her word was final. Nothing more, nothing less. At that moment, the door to the Swan family's carriage opened. The first to step out was a young woman. Her demeanor and elegance was a step below that of Mistress Era. However, her looks were not in the least bit inferior. Her charm lay in her openness. She wore a modest blue dress that matched well with her deep black hair and fair complexion. A perpetual, inviting smile hung from her lips, capturing the hearts of all those who saw her. The moment this young woman stepped out, 8 youths riding war horses of their own stepped down from them, following to her back in an orderly fashion. Young Miss Swan, the crowd seemed to be breathless for a moment. Just as the atmosphere was reaching its peak, the Kiafur family carriage opened. Syl descended with a bright smile. She didn't look directly at the crowd, but it still felt as though she had greeted them all one by one. She was nothing like the flustered young lady who didn't know how to respond to Lionel's bluntness and played every bit the part of elegant noblewoman. Her charisma was no less than young Miss Swan. In fact, since she picked up some tips from her own sister-in-law, her own demeanor was even slightly more refined than the latter. However, it was at that instant that something no one could have possibly expected to happen occurred. Another person stepped out from the carriage, but his appearance came with what sounded like the shattering of countless hearts. The moment the young man appeared, it was as though a spear had suddenly been brandished before the world. A sharpening blade resonated in the ears of all those who saw him, causing the air to grow several times heavier. The young man's almost golden hair swayed gently beneath his billowing aura, a faint violet hue collecting around him like a cloud. It felt as though his immediate surroundings had become his inescapable domain, a place he controlled all to his own. For those moments, he overshadowed Syl completely. Thoughts that he wasn't worthy to stand by her side didn't even have a chance to manifest before they were ruthlessly crushed. It was to the point that no one even noticed the black brand between his brows. At that moment, let alone those watching on, even Syl was stunned. Was this the same young man who had sat quietly within their carriage for so long? The same young man who had entered their city in rags? The legs of the war horses around Lionel trembled, causing some of the riders to almost fall off completely. Zemo's eyes narrowed. At that moment, he admonished himself for ever doubting the judgment of the mistress. Lionel swept a gaze over the crowd. He knew that in order to catch Aina's attention, he had to stand out as much as possible. He no longer bothered to restrain his aura, nor did he feign his usual modesty. Since he was here, he would make sure his name resounded throughout Terrain. At that moment, even the elegant young Miss Swan couldn't help but look toward him with a hint of shock and curiosity in her eyes. Then, she swept a glance toward Syl with a teasing expression. Within the carriage, Era was holding back a pouting Ri who was clearly dissatisfied by the fact she wasn't allowed to go. "Sister-in-law, I want to go too." Era shook her head. "You can enter the spectator stands with me later. You won't be able to enter the gates the normal way regardless." Though Era spoke these words to appease Ri, it was clear that she was absent-minded. Her gaze glistened as she watched Lionel's back through the curtains of the carriage. She felt that this was the true Lionel. But if that was the case, it'd be even more difficult to control than she thought. Still, he was a bit too naive. Regardless of what reasons he had for showing off his sharpness now, he was already being slowly ensnared by her. Looking toward her little sister-in-law's blushing face as she gazed toward Lionel who had suddenly appeared to her side, Era's slight smile appeared once again. Chapter 354. Lionel's aura blazed like the sun. Somehow, even with a beauty like Syl standing by him, she was the one who was overshadowed. "Who is that?" The crowd had fallen into a temporary silence before they suddenly erupted with discussion. Am I seeing things? Did the Kefir family marry my goddess away? In the minds of those on terrain, the only reason a male could be sharing a carriage like this with the younger sister of the Kefir family heir could only be this. These big families cared too much about their reputation to allow even an inkling of rumors to start without adequate cause. This meant that even if these two weren't betrothed now, it wouldn't be long before they were. Of all those here, Sil seemed to be the one who understood this the most clearly, especially after she realized her sister-in-law was actually blocking Ri from exiting the carriage. Even if Ri's appearance wouldn't completely quell the rumors, it would at least calm some of the heat she was feeling now. Lionel, however, seemed oblivious to all of this. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the youths who had descended from their war horses. He could easily sense the hostility in their eyes. But, surprisingly, Xyler, who should feel the most wronged, was silent and refused to meet his eyes. I can tell that you all are unsatisfied. Sil blinked, not expecting Lionel to be so direct. The version of Lionel she knew was closed off and restrained. She had no idea that this wasn't the real Lionel. Lionel wasn't a cold or arrogant person. He liked to think of himself as social and lively. But, circumstances seemed to constantly be pushing his true self away. Hearing Lionel's words, as though they held some compelling spell to them, the youths who were glaring at him still couldn't help but listen. And, though I know you all don't want to hear it, I'm sure you also understand that it wasn't my choice to be here either, right? Xyler clenched his fists. Hey, watch your words. A petite young woman stepped toward Lionel. Clearly she didn't like Lionel's words. What worse thing was there to hear after losing something that the person who got it didn't even appreciate it? In some ways, that felt worse than said person just gloating. That said, how could Lionel not understand this? He swept a glance toward the petite young woman, causing her next words to get caught in her throat. For whatever reason, beneath Lionel's direct gaze, she couldn't seem to muster up any courage to continue her tirade. I don't say this to belittle Xyler, I say this so that we can get an understanding of one another. Those were simply my feelings in the past. Now that I've seen those city gates and laid eyes on the war scenes it depicts, Lionel's hair billowed beneath his aura, his eyes blazing like two torches. He couldn't help but grin, the rushing of his blood sounding like crashing waterfalls in his ears. I have not a single intention of giving my spot up. Lionel's almost fiendish grin caused the petite woman to stumble. You seven and Sil are my teammates. I hope that instead of letting animosity get the best of you, you'll realize that sabotaging me is the very same as disrespecting Xyler. The young woman and the others were stunned. That was right, if they could get enraged simply because Lionel said that he didn't want the position to begin with, how much worse would it be to ruin the opportunity he had? Suddenly, the petite young woman felt as though she had fallen into a trap she couldn't get out of. Lionel smiled. Let's go. Lionel turned toward the gates. Despite the fact they were half a kilometer away, it felt as though they were bearing down on him. This level of majesty was far beyond anything he had seen in his lifetime before. Sil and the others subconsciously followed his steps, not realizing their actions until Lionel suddenly stopped and looked back toward Xyler. Xyler stood with his fists clenched, looking toward their backs as blood trickled between his fingers. He was the first person to not avoid Lionel's gaze when he met them. Second place was never an option for me, Lionel said plainly. At first, it sounded as though Lionel was leaving behind some scolding words for Xyler. However, what Xyler heard was completely different. What he heard was a promise. Sil blinked, not really believing what she was seeing. How did he rein in these arrogant geniuses? Even she could hardly do it, and that was only because of her family background, while the other half of the reason was because they wanted to marry her. Plus, how did she suddenly become a background character? Before she could realize what was happening, their group had caught up to the Swan families. Lionel stood at the helm with Sil by his side. Young Miss Swan stood at the forefront of her own group, looking toward them curiously. All of them stood at the demarcation line. Those without talent didn't dare to cross this 500-meter mark from the brave city gates. If they dared to do so, they would only be asking for death. Young Miss Swan blinked. Is this your man, little Sil? He's quite good. I'm a little bit jealous. Lionel pretended as though he hadn't heard anything, but Sil suddenly became flushed. The men within young Miss Swan's group stared daggers toward Lionel. It seemed they didn't quite like that their goddess was praising another man. A particular large one amongst them, standing a head taller than even the already tall Lionel, shot an aura of competition toward him. Lionel planned to ignore this and take the first step forward. However, it was then that a rush surged through the crowd once again. It seemed that another city lord power had appeared. Chapter 355. The Black City Escort. This city seemed to take their name quite seriously. Their war steeds were a deep shade of night with a singular jagged horn gracing their foreheads. Their carriage seemed carved of carbon and an oppressive aura hung over them all. Bang! The carriage doors opened. The first thing anyone saw was a heavily armored leg smashing against the ground. Lionel could tell that if it wasn't for the fact this was a fourth-dimensional world, the ground would have been cracked beyond repair. But, even then, the weight of this man was undeniable. And, when he came into view, his oppressive presence seemed to overshadow all things. The man's beard could only be described as furious. It ran across his face and jaw like the blades of a knife. It was objectively unkempt. But, if the man groomed it, something would feel off, as though this was his natural state. The state of the man's face made it hard to tell his age. But those with sharp senses could tell that he was also a youth. His heavy black armor clinked about as he walked. Without having to say a word, 8 followed him in tow, soon reaching the demarcation line as well. At that moment, the young man grinned, seeing the two beauties. Lucky, lucky. I was assigned to the same entrance as two beauties. Sil and young Miss Swan looked toward this young man with a hint of disgust and trepidation in their eyes. It was clear to them that Lionel was far more pleasing to the eye, especially since, other than his odd beard, this young man's head reflected the sun about as well as a polished mirror. That said, considering his status, his bald head had never gotten in his way of wooing women. So, why would he care? At that moment, the little mink around Lionel's shoulder snickered. It seemed that many had missed its presence, just like many hadn't noticed the brand between Lionel's brows. When the man heard this, it looked toward Lionel and found the little mink, causing his eyes to glow. He could sense something he deeply liked within the body of this little mink. I want your beast, he suddenly said. The little mink hopped to Lionel's head, wrapping around itself and yawning. The appearance of its little pink tongue made it seem as though it wasn't worried about the black-armored, bald man at all. Lionel swept a glance toward the black-armored man. There was a reason he had waited here, and it definitely wasn't out of respect for this man. Achievements were only worth something if others didn't achieve. There would be no happiness if there was no sadness, no joy if there was no despair. The more people there were to act as a contrast to him, the better. The black-armored man could tell that despite the fact Lionel had to look up, he wasn't oppressed by his aura in the slightest. However, unlike everyone else who had been starstruck by Lionel's appearance, the black-armored man was, likewise, not. Lives unfair, Lionel said plainly. Unfortunately, you can't always have what you want. Hearing Lionel's words, the young man was stunned for a moment before suddenly grinning fiendishly. Slave brand. Third dimension. Little pretty gigolo. I never thought that someone like this would actually dare to speak to me in this way. The man's words were like a bomb going off in the crowd. Everyone had been so overwhelmed by Lionel's presence that they hardly dared to observe him closely. It was only after hearing these things that they suddenly realized that the black-armored man was correct. Lionel's lip curled, but the smile held a hint of coldness to it. He actually didn't mind the man saying such words. Sometimes, infamy was the best form of fame. However, Lionel still marked this man as one that needed to be taught a lesson. Now, he just had the perfect excuse to do so. Seeing Lionel's unperturbed smile, the black armored man felt some discomfort. It seems we have something in common, Lionel said lightly. Before, no one dared to speak to me in this way either. It was only after the world began to change that some gained an overinflated sense of self-importance. It seems like you're another one of them. How about we make a bet? The smile within Lionel's gaze deepened. I don't have any words as pointed as gigolo to call you, but what do you say, Baldy? The man's gaze narrowed as a silence fell over the crowd. It seems you want to die. His voice became like gravel as his aura bore down on Lionel. Do you accept, or not, Baldy? Lionel replied. The man stared toward Lionel before bursting out into a fit of laughter. When he finally stopped, his aura had become as heavy as a mountain, bearing down on everyone present. Whether it was his love of women or his want for the little mink, he forgot about them all in that very instant. What is this bet? If the stakes are too small, I just might take your life right here and now. Isn't there a trial right before us now? Lionel said plainly. I'll not only outperform you, I'll embarrass you. As for the stakes, do you dare to bet your life? Maybe it was because the valiant aura of the brave city gates was fueling his raging blood. Or, maybe it was because Lionel was going all out to stand out as much as possible, but, whatever the truth was, a bloodthirsty and cold presence seemed to exude from him. The man faltered slightly. Then, he seemed to truly see Lionel for the first time. I, Jeffrak Black, have never stepped down from any challenge. Good. Lionel replied plainly. Lionel took a step forward and crossed the line. As though a beast was roaring in his face, his hair whipped back violently, his face even distorting slightly. Since you've reported your name, I'll do the same. I'm Lionel Morales. Remember it well. Chapter 356. Syl panicked. The first reason was Lionel's crazy challenge and the second reason was the little mink. Lionel was still in the third dimension while Jeffrak had long since entered the fourth. On top of that, there was no way the little mink could withstand the pressure of Brave City. She had been so distracted before that she hadn't remembered the little beast until Jeffrak mentioned it. Now that she had, she couldn't help but close her eyes, not wanting to watch such an innocent little beast die like this. However, even with her eyes closed and several seconds ticking by, the sound she expected to hear never reached her ears. Everyone watched in shock as Lionel took one step after another. It seemed as though the pressure couldn't do much more to him than kick up a strong wind. As for the little mink, it growled a bit. But, afterward, its body exuded a slight black fog. Soon, it was sleeping again as though nothing had happened. At that moment, Lionel turned back toward their group. Aren't you all coming? Lionel asked. With that, Lionel continued forward. In his sights, the looming walls bore down on him as though trying to crush his will. Syl grit her teeth and took a step forward as well. The instant she did, she felt her knees buckle for a moment before they straightened. As though her actions were a cue, the youths began to move as one, their actions the subject of great entertainment for the surrounding crowd that didn't dare to follow. Jeffrak, too, took a heavy step forward, plowing through the pressure until he matched up to Lionel's speed. His gaze didn't leave Lionel's side profile as though he was waiting for the latter to collapse. Since he had accepted the bet, he wouldn't attack Lionel now. However, the moment Lionel showed any signs of collapsing, he would strike him dead. No one, not even his own brothers, would dare to talk to him in the way Lionel had. And, this arrogant prick actually dared to report his name right after his? He really wanted to see how far a third-dimensional ant could go. At that moment, across the 8 gates of Brave City, similar competitions were happening all over. The fervor of the crowds in these locations were no less. However, the location of the Swan, Kia Fur, and Black families was still among the most heated. How could it not be if a bet to the death was taking place? However, the quick conclusion many were expecting never came. Lionel's steps remained steady. In fact, it seemed as though he had forgotten all about the world around him. He continued to stare intently at the gates before him, the images of battle being firmly ingrained into his mind. He lost himself in his focus, causing a familiar aura to billow out from around him. Jeffrak felt his heart seize when he felt it. To a genius like him, making it to the gates was an easy task. He was leisurely strolling just like Lionel was. They both knew that the true distinguishing factors would only make themselves known at the gates themselves. However, feeling such an aura, Jeffrak's steps faltered. He even felt that the pressure coming from Lionel was a step more forceful than even the brave city gates. Soon, the group separated. In the very front, there was Lionel and Jeffrak. A step behind them were young Miss Swan and Syl. And, much further behind them were the petite young woman and the other lackeys of the city lord Powers. Who is he? Young Miss Swan looked towards Syl with curious, blinking eyes. A delicate sweat covered her elegant brow. But, rather than destroying her demeanor, it made her look more pitiable. She played the role of vulnerable princess in need of saving exceptionally well. It was clear that the two women could be walking side by side with Lionel and Jeffrak should they want to. However, there was no need to enter a big dick contest between men. Whether they reached the gates first or last, it wouldn't make much of a difference as long as they did so within the allotted time. Realizing this, why would young Miss Swan not take the opportunity to learn a bit more about this mysterious Lionel character? Syl blinked innocently, a beautiful smile crossing her soft pink lips. None of your business. The two women walked side by side, smiling amicably. Yet, the atmosphere was deathly cold. Maybe this was the hypocrisy of women. They too were having their own big dick contest, it was just more covert. At that moment, Jeffrak was still observing Lionel. Maybe due to the influence of the brave city gates, but he was the only one who could sense this oppressive aura coming from Lionel. He seemed to realize this as well, judging by the reactions of everyone else, so he bit down hard on his tongue so as not to lose face. However, Lionel couldn't be bothered to deal with him. A huge chunk of herb ore suddenly appeared in his hand. This pressure makes it easier to absorb the herb essence. Thanks to his breakthrough, Lionel was already within the superior stage. At this level, his body was already comparable to a weak pseudo-fourth dimension metal, and he was only a stage away from perfection. Disregard, Lionel had already gotten his use out of Jeffrak. What happened from here on out between them didn't matter to him as long as he beat him. Jeffrak seemed to sense this as well, and it lit a fire in his chest. However, no amount of his anger seemed to change a single thing. For entities as strong as them, it should have only taken less than a minute to cross 500 meters. Yet, under the pressure, it took them a half hour. When the gates became clear, everyone seemed to understand that this was where the true trial began. The doors loomed to an impossibly tall height. Standing beneath them, Lionel could only lift his head vertically. And even then, it was hard to see the tops of the walls. However, it was these very doors they needed to push to enter. Chapter 357. Jeffrak was drenched in sweat. In order not to lose face, he had kept up with Lionel's pace from start to finish. But the result made his lungs scream. Unfortunately, the pressure of the gates had nothing to do with strength. Even a fifth-dimensional entity would face a proportional amount of pressure. This was, of course, the same for Jeffrak. But, what Jeffrak couldn't believe was that Lionel seemed unaffected. Let alone breathing as heavily as him, Lionel didn't even seem as though he had sweated a single drop. To make matters worse, Jeffrak was certain that the reason he was in such a sorry state was because of the pressure of the wall, but rather because of the pressure from Lionel himself. Finally, for the first time since their competition began, Lionel looked toward Jeffrak. "You don't look too good, Baldy. You doing okay?" Jeffrak's gaze flashed with a bloody red. He glared at Lionel, his chest heaving. At that moment, from atop the city walls, a few individuals looked down with curiosity. They all seemed like youths as well. However, whether they had gone through the same trials or not was unknown. "Isn't that Black City's bald boy? He looks like he's in a pretty sorry state. What happened to him?" The few on the wall chuckled. However, let alone hearing them, those below couldn't even see them. It was as though they were in a completely different world. The only one who frowned, seemingly realizing something was off, was Lionel. However, even with his senses, he had no way of seeing through the brave city barrier. He only felt a faint itching at the small of his back as though he was being watched. Which door do you think they'll be able to open? PFT, aren't you just wondering if we'll have any competition? Regardless, if they're anything below Royal ITLL be too much of a disappointment. If that was the case, I would have gotten up to come all the way over here for no reason. If you wanted to watch true elites, you should have gone to watch the gates with powers rather than this city lord gate. It's rare for anything meaningful to come out of the cities. And, those that are worth watching have already entered the city. Well, isn't that madman's sister down there? Maybe the genes run in the Kiafur family. The others looked at the young man who spoke like he was crazy. You know that madman is overprotective about anything related to his wife and his little sister. You better watch your mouth. I don't care if you die, but if I'm guilty by association, who will I go complain to? It was clear that these people were speaking about Sil's elder brother. It seemed that he had already entered the city. However, oddly enough, his wife and Sil's sister-in-law, Era, didn't seem to be a participant. It obviously wasn't because Era was too weak, and it obviously wasn't because she was too old. Whatever the true reason behind this was seemed a bit complicated. Regardless, Lionel wasn't privy to this information as he couldn't even hear the conversation. Still, all those on the top of the city walls seemed to accept this person's word as law, and they all closed their mouths. It's a shame though. Someone else picked up the conversation that had fallen to silence. The cities are only going to fall further and further behind the powers at this rate. If they don't get themselves together and see the bigger picture, they'll be left behind. The others sneered hearing this. It was clear they were all from powers themselves, or they wouldn't be reacting like this. It isn't their fault. Their structures are flawed from the beginning. Us powers are built on strength first and foremost, while their foundations are economy and governance. To them, abandoning terrain would ruin their futures completely, whereas for us, wherever there's room for self-improvement, we'll be able to thrive. They only have themselves to blame for their collapse. The words these young masters spoke easily uncovered the dark underbelly of terrain without regard. Unlike the common people who had to tiptoe around their words, these nobles spoke their minds freely and boldly. This was the representation of true power. The group snickered. Oh, looks like someone is going to try. Huh. Is that boy really in the third dimension? They had been so lost in their own worlds that it was only now they noticed that the young man teaching Jirak his place was actually within the third dimension. For one, they had never heard of a person in the third dimension even making it through the pressure of the gates. Though the pressure was adjusted based on strength, there was still a minimum requirement for foundation. They had simply never seen someone within the third dimension meet these standards. And, secondly, anyone who could make a fool out of Jirak should definitely be a monster. The only reason they hadn't paid more attention to Lionel before despite this was because the city lord system was declining harshly. Though Jirak had some fame, they all docked him several points simply by virtue of this. Why would they care about someone who was only beating someone they didn't care much about to begin with? Would you care about the power of someone capable of stomping an ant to death? Bang. At that moment, Lionel's palm touched the tall doors, his robes and hair billowing. Jirak, who was already hardly able to stand on his own 2 feet, was blasted flying, rolling in the dirt until he slowly landed before the feet of the 2 women who were still a good distance from the gates. Lionel felt a force trying to rip his arm apart. Strong energies surged toward him, but they rebounded off his body like crossing blades, filling the air with the sound of harsh sharpening metal. Bang! The ground beneath Lionel's feet cracked slightly. Fine lines raced across, meeting together and separating just as quickly as they spread outward. Lionel closed his eyes. He could sense the 5 levels of the door. In fact, it wasn't much different from the scene he saw when unlocking his metal synergy lineage factor. Soldier. General. Royal. King. Emperor. The whole city quaked. Lionel thought of waiting for Jirak to go first again. But, after seeing his poor performance, Lionel felt that it was beneath him to even need such a person to contrast himself with. He simply served no purpose. In that case, he would make it a one-man show. His singular palm rested the door. He could feel it pushing back against him, wanting to throw him away the very same way Jirak had been. Lionel's eyes shot open. Bronze runes raced across his body, a halo of bronze violet appearing above his head. Those with lineage factors suddenly felt their hearts tremble, their blood running in reverse. Open. Bang. The scene was one those watching would never forget. Chapter 358. Bang. Bang. The gates flew open. In those moments, it felt as though a tornado had formed around Lionel. On one side, wind rushed in violently, blowing everything away. On the other, an undefeatable suction surged, sweeping up everything in a rush of quicksand-like wind. However, nothing was as deafening as the sound of the gates smashing against the hallowed walls of Brave City. The reverberation was so resounding, so cacophonic, so tempestuous that the whole city quaked. At that moment, no matter what section of the city you were in, everyone looked toward the same direction, shock coloring their features. This commotion? What could it possibly be? Those that could see what was happening were shocked to the point of speechlessness. The crowd that had been spectating from half a kilometer away only saw Lionel place a single palm forward before doors that towered into the skies nearly flew off their hinges beneath his presence. In fact, the ground beneath their feet quaked endlessly, causing some weaker individuals to fall to their butts, unable to understand what they had just seen. Just what level of strength was this? Of course, these people had no idea that opening the doors wasn't a contest of strength, it was a contest of will and battle aura. However, to Lionel, who had already fully awakened the first level of his metal synergy lineage factor, it was nothing but a joke. In fact, Lionel even felt it was too easy. Soldier, general, royal, king and emperor. Lionel thought to himself, looking into the massive window toward the city he had created himself. Something seems to be missing. Lionel took a step forward, crossing the threshold. A wash of energy flooded toward him, coalescing into a golden brand between his brows. Compared to the runes that shone across his body, it was lacking in momentum and radiance. However, to those of Brave City, this golden mark was the highest entry honor of the city, the Emperor class. Lionel had no idea the level of commotion his actions would cause. Brave City was separated into tiers. Much like some parts of society, there were locations one could not enter without the appropriate credentials or standing. Within the city, these separating lines were even more exaggerated. The city itself isn't like how one would think it would be. Rather than being a metropolis, Brave City looked more like a war camp. There were no paved roads. Just like the outside of the city walls, the ground was covered in nothing but a brownish soil that looked like the land of a military practice ground. In every which direction, one could find monuments of stone called the Bravery Pillars. They depicted the exploits of soldiers and generals of the past and were among the most important staples of Brave City. Rather than buildings, much of Brave City was an arrangement of tents, especially the outer city limits. Only royals were allowed to live in small hut-like structures while only emperors had stone housing for themselves. However, despite this seemingly organized structure, there was nothing peaceful about this city. Battles of all sorts seemed to take place every moment. Whether it was a battle for resources, for the monuments or even for housing, it seemed as though one would take place all the time. Outside of the seemingly territorial housing system, there didn't seem to be a single ounce of order throughout the whole city. Except for in just one place. A singular tower stood in the very middle of the city. Aside from the walls of the city itself, it was the only structure that stood above 2 or 3 stories tall. In fact, it shot hundreds of meters into the air much like the war-etched walls on the outside. From the top of this tower, one could overlook the whole city and all 8 of its gates. However, to be able to step to this floor, the minimum requirement was to be a king. For someone of such standing, they obviously wouldn't come here to overlook ants they thought to be beneath them. That said, there were exceptions to every rule. Just how much commotion would the swinging of doors hundreds of meters high cause? Just how much worse would this commotion be if the action was so violent that the doors hardly stopped even after slamming into the walls that held it up? Everyone knew that for the whole gate to open, it could only mean that a new emperor had appeared. However, even past emperors hadn't caused such a commotion, and most people could only hurriedly squeeze through a crack they caused in the gates. Who had ever heard of someone being given such a wide berth? At that moment, the usually bustling top tower floor fell into silence. Their eyes all landed on the same young man. Compared to the size of the doors, he seemed so small, like an ant that could be stamped into a meat paste at any moment. However, it was as though the doors didn't dare to close as he walked through. They stayed attached to the walls, still reverberating with residue of the previous impact that, even to this moment, resounded in everyone's ears like an endless echo. Who is that? They were all stunned to find out that none of them recognized the young man. Other than feeling some trembling in their hearts toward the odds runes drawn across his body, there was nothing else they could glean about him. It seemed that a variable had appeared. Within the tower, 3 familiar faces could be found. Well, they weren't quite familiar to Lionel. However, had Aina been there would be no doubt that she would recognize these people at first glance. Young heir of Cliff's Edge Terrace, Rain-Red Solar. Young heiress to World's End Falls, Jilnia Falls. Young heir to Mirage Pavilion, Wheeless Mirage. These 4 people had no idea how they were connected, but it didn't seem to matter. Brave City would make them enemies regardless. At that moment, as though everyone had realized a singular threat before them, several auras locked onto Lionel. Chapter 359. Bang! A shadowy figure shot through the roof of an inn, causing brick and chips of wood to fly through the air. The shocked screams of the citizens rocked the small city, but the shadowy figure continued to leap from wall to wall and house to house, eventually landing atop the city walls. These walls couldn't compare to those of Brave City in the slightest. They were at most 10 meters tall and a few meters thick. This place was only considered a Tier 7 city that couldn't compare even to Swan, Black or Kiefer City. However, it was unique in that rather than being under the jurisdiction of a city lord power, it was beneath the power of World's End Falls. When the shadowy figure finally came to a stop, those that could see it shivered. The figure was completely covered in a black cloak. Its back hunched up in a curved arc, making it difficult to tell just how someone with a body like this could possibly move so agilely. The figure held a massive great sword in their hands that spanned the length of 3 meters. Even now, it glistened with the blood of several guards. At that moment, the city guards charged from all directions wearing white robes alternating in a sky blue soft armor. Sword Monstress. The cloak covering the face of the sword monstress blew off, revealing the figure's features. It took but a moment for them all to recognize this scourge of terrain. She could only be described as a grotesque woman. She had a hunched back, her hair was unkempt and wild, and her face made the stomachs of all those who saw her crawl. They had long since lost count of the number of massacres this beast had been the cause of. She had wanted posters almost everywhere, yet she somehow managed to vanish whenever they seemed close to catching her. The sword monstress gaze looked particularly demonic. As though she had lost all sense of human reason, she all but growled in response. Without a word, she leapt forward, her monstrous sword being raised in her claw-like hands. The guard who had spoken found his vision splitting in 2. Before he could even react, his consciousness faded, his body falling to the ground in 2 halves. The sword monstress body flashed, her sword drawing lines of crimson throughout the streets. Blood flowed to the stone-paved ground, seeping through the cracks and dyeing them red. Each life she reaped was only met by a violent gaze that only seemed to grow more and more bloodthirsty. It was as though it wasn't enough, as though she wanted more. At that moment, the head guard of the Tier 7 city had finally gotten word of what was happening and began to rush over. The sword monstress, seemingly realizing the incoming danger, suddenly stopped her endless slaughter. She looked toward the distance, two sharp teeth shining through her heaving breath. Her body blurred, accelerating toward the distance. She leapt over the city wall as though it didn't exist, vanishing toward the wilderness before the head guard could long onto her. By the time the head guard appeared amidst the carnage, she had already long since left, leaving him standing there with a chest filled with rage and nothing to vent it on. Inform the higher-ups that she's escaped the encirclement by unknown means. Her next destination is unknown. The head guard clenched his fists. He already knew that his punishment for this wouldn't be small, but it was simply too difficult to lock onto a single target who hadn't been branded. With everyone headed toward Brave City, the in and out flux of tourists and citizens was too high. This was likely the worst time to be trying to catch a criminal. Lionel walked into the city. He swept his gaze over everything once before heading in deeper. Era hadn't told him much about the city and how things worked. All he knew was that entering was a test, and the better he performed, the greater benefits there was. Other than this, he also knew that when he chose an abode to stay in, he had to stay in this eastern section of the city since he entered through the eastern section. This wasn't to say that it was impossible to travel to other sections, but rather that it was seen as an act of war that could spark something he currently didn't have the means to deal with. Lionel, though, had his own reasons for being eager to enter the city. It wasn't just about making his name known so he could find Aina easier, it was also about finding a safe place to break through. Lionel felt like Brave City was the best place he could ever find to break through with his soul force. In fact, Lionel knew that he had no choice but to do this. If he didn't, he would have no way of dealing with the trials to come in the future. After claiming a home, you could receive a half-day's protection. But, after that, Lionel knew that trouble would come knocking at his door. In truth, even if he broke through, Lionel wasn't quite confident in protecting himself. All of the spells he had, even the most powerful 3-star Magus arts, were still mere third-dimensional spells. Lionel didn't know how useful they would be against fourth-dimensional existences. Knowing this, rather than going off to quickly find a house to claim, Lionel waited for Syl. He felt that this city would most definitely have opportunities for him to take advantage of. He would take his time to find them before taking advantage of the 12-hour protection he would receive. This was, of course, the best plan. Lionel's thoughts were meticulous and well thought out. It was just a shame that trouble would find him before he could act on it completely. Those youths that had just been standing atop the wall recovered from their shock and stabilized their feet, having almost fallen from the wall thanks to Lionel's entry. After sending a glance toward each other, one after another, they descended the walls. Soon, they stood on level ground along with Lionel as the heavy gates slammed shut. Bang! Chapter 360. Lionel swept a glance toward the group before him. Though there were just 4 of them, each had the marks of royals on their foreheads. Lionel still wasn't exactly sure what this system of ranking meant, but just by virtue of this, he was aware of why these 4 had come. However, he wasn't worried. These 4 didn't have any ability to take his mark of an emperor until he chose a home and had held it in his possession for 12 hours. Since he hadn't even chosen a home yet, it was impossible for them to do so. That said, that didn't mean they couldn't act without reward, likely in an attempt to get him to hand over the mark himself. The 4 young men and women looked Lionel up and down with curiosity. "Who are you?" one of them suddenly asked. The speaker wore red robes matched with violet soft armor. Had Lionel been well informed, he would know that this young man came from Mirage Pavilion. However, considering his ignorance, other than noticing the well-matched colors, he didn't really think anything more of it. Lionel smiled carefreely. "My name is Lionel Morales." In Lionel's opinion, the more people who knew his name, the better. He didn't care about what tone the speaker was using, even if he was quite condescending. All that mattered to Lionel was that more people knew his name. The happenings of terrain meant little to him, and he also didn't particularly care about what this brave city represented and the reason so many youths had come to this place. All he cared about was making his way back to Earth after finding Aina. If Lionel were to say what his goals were aside from finding her, it would only be destroying the royal blue fort and helping Aina get revenge. Though he didn't know the full extent of Aina's backstory, knowing that the Brazinger family had wronged her was enough for him. Seeing Lionel's bright smile, the four were caught off guard. They had fully expected Lionel to lash out or even ignore them, giving them ample reason to stomp all over his pride. Though they asked who Lionel was, they already knew that he was a member of the Kiafur family. To them, other than Syl's elder brother, there was no one else worth fearing from this family. Even if Lionel was a bit more talented than their usual selections, so what? He was still within the third dimension. Even the weakest individual knew how impossible it was to cross the dimensional barrier to battle, let alone doing so against 4 people. As far as they were concerned, Lionel was finished. However, as the saying went, it was hard to punch a smiling face. At that moment, the large doors were opened once again. However, this time, instead of the whole gate moving, it was simply one of the inner gates. And, instead of it almost flying from its hinges as it had done just moments ago, barely a crack was formed for a tall, black-armored figure to squeeze through in a sorry state. It could only be said that the harsh reality of comparing yourself to another was too heart-wrenching. Jirak practically collapsed to the ground, heaving out such heavy breaths that it seemed he might cough up his lung at any moment. He placed his hands on his knees to keep himself from lying flat on the dusty roads. Unfortunately, he huffed up a big mouthful of kicked-up dirt, causing him to cough violently. He couldn't have been in a sorrier state, causing the 4 youths to snicker. When Jirak heard this, he looked up, his eyes reddening. "Who the fuck are you? You dare to laugh at me?" The youths wanted to laugh again, but Jirak suddenly vanished, appearing amidst the group and sending out a fist. The air shook beneath his strength, folding in on itself and layering his fists in a quaking wind. Lionel's lip twitched as he watched this. What kind of man with a wind affinity this high wears heavy army like that? At first glance, he should be an earth affinity mage like me. Bang! The youth from the Mirage Pavilion was sent flying. Lionel could tell with a single glance that his jaw was snapped from its hinges. It was clear that whatever meals this youth would be having over the next few weeks would have to be through a straw. Who else? Who else was laughing it up? Come on, tell me. Where's the joke? I want to laugh too. It was impossible for anyone to tell that these 4 youths had just been standing atop the walls of the city, commenting on how weak Jirak was. Lionel watched in silence, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lip. This Jirak was an interesting character. Jirak's fist slammed into the second male, sending him tumbling toward the first. They piled atop of one another, groaning and without the strength to stand. Get a room, you bunch of perverts. Jirak growled before looking toward the 2 women. I don't hit girls. Before the 2 women could sigh a breath of relief, Jirak continued. Smack each other until I'm satisfied. The 2 women looked at one another, then back at Jirak as though they were ready to fight to the death. But, upon seeing Jirak rubbing his fists, their hearts trembled and they turned toward one another, each trying to get the first hit in. Jirak clapped, a wide grin spreading across his face. He brought his fingers to his mouth, whistling as though he was encouraging them to go on. Go on, fight harder. Yeah, just like that. Hey, I bet she won't be able to fight as hard if you rip her clothes. Whistle, what a show. What delicate skin. Oh, I think I see a little pink. Top tier, top tier. Jirak took out some herb coins and started flicking them toward the 2 fighting girls. He looked like he was having the time of his life. Lionel stood to the side, speechless. Chapter 361. Just when Jirak was getting into his groove, the gates opened once again and this time, 2 women entered. Of course, they were Syl and young Miss Swan. When the 2 women saw the scene before them, they charged toward Jirak like a twin pair of lionesses. In fact, they even sent glaring daggers toward Lionel for not stepping in to stop this madman earlier. Toward such a thing, Lionel only chuckled and didn't say much. He was going to step in previously, but since they were here now, he didn't have to do anything. All right. Since these two she-devils have stepped in for you, leave your panties behind and we can call it even. The two women shivered in terror hearing these words. Jirak. Sil snapped. All right. Forget it. Jirak shook his head as though it was truly a pity. Looking quite pitiable, the two women helped their two friends up and they stumbled away. It was only now they noticed that Jirak actually had a king mark on his forehead. It seemed that they had been so distracted by how terrible he looked before that they had forgotten to account for this. It was only after this that Jirak suddenly looked toward Lionel seriously. Do what you will. Jirak closed his eyes, crossing his arms across his chest and lifting his neck as though waiting for a blade to run across it. The little mink atop Lionel's head yawned lazily before sticking out its tongue as though to make fun of Jirak. It got bored of this quite quickly though and went back to its nap. Lionel could tell that the little guy was growing more languid lately. The little mink he knew was always lively and looking to play. Lionel wasn't sure if this change was it maturing or if there was another reason. That aside, Lionel wasn't thinking much about this right now. He was only quite surprised that Jirak actually seemed to be waiting for death. Of course, Lionel had never really expected to kill him in the first place. For one, he wasn't a bloodthirsty person and he didn't enjoy to kill unless it was absolutely necessary. And, secondly, he had only been saying the most boisterous things he could say for the sake of making sure his story spread as widely as possible. Lionel suddenly smiled. So your life is mine, right? Jirak opened his eyes and frowned. But in the end. Yes. Good. Lionel's smile widened. Follow me then. I also don't know enough about this place, so tell me about it. Jirak raised his brows, unclenching fists he hadn't known he had clenched. Isn't Sil your fiancée? She didn't tell you anything about this? Lionel made a weird face. Fiancée? No, she isn't. Sil suddenly flushed as red as a tomato. Do you believe I won't rip your tongue out, Jirak? Jirak blinked. So, she's single? Jirak. Young Miss Swan giggled from the sidelines, seemingly enjoying this quite a bit. After a while, her eyes sparkled when she looked toward Lionel. So, he's single too. Lionel, however, was no longer paying attention to their antics. His gaze seemed to cut through space, landing on a tower in the distance. From there, he could feel numerous gazes on him, all of which seemed to be waiting for something. Lionel felt his blood surging. Who knew how long it would take him to realize that his actions over the past few hours weren't as much of an act as he thought it was? You're saying no one knows where Brave City came from? Lionel looked toward Jirak, Sil and Kyra with a weird expression. Of course, Kyra was the first name of young Miss Swan. After listening to the banter between the two women, Lionel finally managed to learn this much. Well. Jirak mumbled. There are some theories, but... Well, the truth is that as a fourth-dimensional world, we don't have high enough standing to confirm or deny this. We only have a few rumors. Lionel could see the discomfort the three felt when Jirak said these words. It seemed that this wasn't something that was acknowledged often. But, in the grand scheme, it was nonetheless true that a fourth-dimensional world wasn't worth mentioning. It made Lionel realize that as small as terrain was, Earth was even more so. What rumors? Lionel asked. Jirak hesitated as though he wasn't sure whether or not he should say. But, maybe because he remembered Lionel owned his life now, he realized he had no choice. They say that brave cities only appear in worlds that are at a crossroad. Lionel frowned. What was that supposed to mean? A crossroad? What kind of crossroad? One where we either develop ourselves or choose to abandon everything our ancestors built. Lionel still wasn't sure if he understood what this meant, but seeing as the three were only growing more uncomfortable, he shifted his focus slightly. Then what does a brave city get out of appearing? Is it like a subdimensional zone? Not exactly. Zones are created by the dimensional verse. But brave cities are built by people. As for what they get out of it, they say it's recruitment. Lionel's brow raised. A world at a crossroad, built by people, it's all for recruitment. Lionel couldn't help but think of the Star and Cross organization. Even to this point, he still didn't know their true name. All he had was a gut feeling that their scope was beyond that of just terrain and that their uniforms were cool. There was nothing else. But who knew that even before he could understand who they were, another mysterious organization would appear? In fact, this one's methods seemed even more shocking than the first. The Star and Cross organization was still tangible to Lionel. He could see them, interact with them, and, unfortunately, be shamed by them. But this brave city organization had no face or image. And they somehow managed to make a city manifest from thin air without even the strongest powers of this world understanding how. For the first time, Lionel was starting to get an understanding that this new world order was anything but peaceful. Chapter 362. Lionel stood at the base of a large stone monument. Just looking at it, it exuded the same type of aura the city gates had. It was just that this aura was displayed on a much smaller scale. Rather than enveloping an area of half a kilometer, this aura acted on just the 10-meter radius of the monument. However, from what Lionel could tell, this aura was actually several times that of the gates, as though it had been concentrated in place. Many people who stood around the monument curiously observed the new group of 4. When they saw that it was made of 3 kings and an emperor, they grew shocked and began to whisper amongst each other. In this sort of place, information was the greatest strength. The fact that they didn't know that these people were among the kings and emperors meant that they could only be new. Lionel. Syl said hesitantly. We still need to go report to my elder brother. Lionel frowned. Report? He felt a strong feeling against doing something like this. There was no telling what kind of personality Syl's elder brother had or how he would react to Lionel's sudden appearance. Emicham, later. Lionel nodded noncommittedly. Syl bit her lip, ignoring Kyra's amused gaze. This damned vixen. Is it necessary to stand so close to him? Still, Lionel didn't seem to notice the squabble between these two women, nor did he seem to realize that Syl's invitation was more about getting him away from young Miss Swan than anything else. But, whether he acknowledged it or not didn't matter much, he already had his own plan in mind. Explain these monuments to me one more time, Jirak. Jirak grumbled. Was he really nothing but a glorified dictionary? He had no idea that this really was the case. Lionel didn't want to expose the true capabilities of the dictionary, so he continued to use it only as a translation tool. He didn't feel like falling out with another organization that lusted after his treasures. All these monuments depict moments in history. There's nothing special about them other than the fact cultivation is a bit faster if you can withstand their aura. You can see it for yourself, it's just telling the tale of some dead general. Lionel nodded. Maybe it was because this brave city wasn't native to terrain, but the words on this monument could be understood by Lionel even without using the dictionary's help. Gained victory after 121 days of battle. Mounted the head of, the more Lionel read, the more useless the information seemed to become. It was almost like a newspaper article. All of the most important facts about the topic were found in the header and the first few paragraphs. As it continued, it got useless to the point of even describing what General Farron had for breakfast that morning. It was no wonder Jirak had said this monument was useless. Lionel had no interest in how many women a general bedded in celebration of his victory. However, no matter how Lionel looked at it, he didn't think that these monuments were so simple because he felt danger from them. His primitive senses made him feel as though if he played around with these monuments too long he could die. The weird part about this feeling was that, obviously, no had died at the hands of this monument before. Had someone died, there was no way everyone here would be so casual about it. In fact, the only slight conflict here was in deciding who was allowed to enter the 10-meter radius of the monument. Of course, danger didn't necessarily mean that this monument would be avoided. After all, with danger came opportunities. But, Jirak would have definitely mentioned it had such a danger existed. Lionel suddenly closed his eyes. A massive spherical force art was reflected in his mind. At that moment, his aura completely changed as though he had become one with nature. Even though he was standing right next to Kyra, Sil, and Jirak, it was as though he was in an entirely different world. When he opened his eyes again and read the first line again, a shocking change occurred. Before Lionel could continue, his vision was enveloped in blackness. When his vision returned, what he saw was no longer a monument. He saw a man wearing a fiery red armor. He sat upon a tall crimson steed and held a halberd that was just as blood red. The aura he exuded was so suffocating that Lionel nearly fell to his knees. At that moment, the man riding the crimson steed stood at the helm of a massive army. He was leading so many men that from afar, they looked like millions of little ants arranged into neat square formations. Yet, despite the number of men, this man stood valiantly, his presence alone subduing the whole of the army. The man leveled his halberd with the ground, his chest growing out a size as he took a deep breath. The moment he released his breath, a mighty roar that shook the skies bore itself into Lionel's heart. Bang! Lionel was sent flying. Blood leaked from his nose and ears, his body skidding along the dirt roads. A violent force tore through his mind, looking to tear his ethereal glabella to shreds. It was as though this force wanted to erase any memories Lionel might have just gained. Lionel. Jirak and the two women were shocked, not knowing what happened. They all looked around with frantic gazes as though trying to find who sneak attacked Lionel. That seemed to be the only explanation for what just happened. Unable to find a thing, they could only rush to his side. But Lionel was out cold, blood continuing to flow from his orifices as a violent energy continued to rampage through his mind. Chapter 363. Lionel. Lionel. No matter how they shouted Lionel's name, it didn't seem to matter in the slightest. The one who attacked him must have wanted him dead, there was no other explanation. The appearance of a third-dimensional emperor was too conspicuous. The number who wanted to take advantage of Lionel's weakness was likely not few. It was simply too easy for those fourth-dimensional monsters to kill Lionel secretly without any of them being any wiser. It couldn't be said that these three would live and die with Lionel. How could they? They had only just met. Jirak was practically Lionel's slave now, while the two women only had a small bit of budding feelings. It wasn't to the point of risking their lives. Yet, all three of them still uncontrollably ran to Lionel's side when they saw his current state. It was clear they all had a good impression of him. The little mink scrambled from Lionel's head, landing on his face and nudging him continuously. The energy continued to rampage throughout Lionel's mind. But, it seemed to notice that it couldn't shatter the barriers of Lionel's ethereal glabella after a few attempts. How could it? After awakening his wisdom branch, Lionel's mind had already become capable of housing fifth-dimensional soul force. Even though he had yet to come in contact with fifth-dimensional force, it didn't change this fact. When comparing the sturdiness of one's ethereal glabella, Lionel was unmatched on terrain and earth. Seemingly realizing this, the energy changed its target, aiming for the embryos that hung vulnerably within the hidden world. By now, Lionel had already formed many embryos. A transparent spear stood for his spear embryo. A 12-pointed star silently whirred for his snowy star owl lineage factor. A bronze-violet halo represented his metal synergy lineage factor. Among them, the one that took up the most space was a bow. Harsh and violent cold winds surged around it, making it difficult even to approach. It seemed ready to tear anything that did apart. It was this group that the energy surged toward, ready to tear it apart. Without hesitation, it targeted Lionel's 12-pointed star first. It could sense that its healing characteristic could become a problem should it be allowed to continue. So, how could it not target it first? But, it was at the very moment it made contact that things suddenly changed. A hidden scarlet energy was stirred. It had hidden itself deeply within the 12-pointed star. No, it was more accurate to say that they had completely fused. The instant the energy came into contact with this scarlet force, it collapsed. There was no suspense, no hard-fought battle, no teetering on the edge of life and death. Just like that, it was snuffed out. The moment this energy was destroyed, Lionel's eyes shot open, his heart beating heavily as though trying to escape his chest. He sat up, catching Little Blackstar before he fell to the ground. Lionel smiled, a sight that looked a bit gruesome considering the blood running down his nose and ears. "It's all right, I'm fine, I'm fine." Lionel comforted the little mink. Lionel wiped the blood from his face with an arm, looking back toward the monument. His gaze narrowed. He realized something. All this time, he had been subconsciously restraining his internal sight. But, when he meditated on the natural force art, in order to appear within his dream world and the real world at the same time, the only option was to use his internal sight. Lionel had learned from Uncle Montez that wantonly using his internal sight was seen as a taboo in this new world order. So, he had always been careful with doing so. This made him miss the fact that his internal sight was severely restricted beneath the aura of this monument. It wasn't that there was nothing to gain from this monument, but rather that anything worth gaining could only be seen through internal sight. It wasn't even necessary for Lionel to use the natural force art to see it. In fact, the fact Lionel used the natural force art caused him to dive too deeply into the world, which was what caused such an exaggerated backlash. Had he dipped his toes in more slowly, he wouldn't have suffered nearly as badly even if he did a bit. Coming to this realization, Lionel understood the crux of the matter. In this world, without internal sight, it was impossible to cultivate. Due to this, it was both a point of emphasis and something that was easily glossed over. These youths standing around the monument might have already tried to examine it with their internal sight, but because theirs was so much weaker than Lionel's, it wasn't even possible for them to cut through the pressure and touch the monument with their senses. Their only option would be to walk through the pressure personally. However, the pressure here was many times that of the gates. Most couldn't even enter a 5-meter radius, let alone get close enough to extend their internal sight. This made Lionel certain that there were very few in this brave city who had succeeded in doing what he had. And, these people, in all likelihood, had kept this secret to themselves. Lionel. Huh. Lionel was suddenly awakened from his thoughts only to find that 3 people were standing above him. These 3 were, of course, Jirak, Kyra and Sil. They looked over him with a mixture of confusion and worry. "Who attack you?" Jirak was the first to ask. "Oh. I'm not sure." Lionel shrugged. It was probably just a warning, or else I'd probably be dead. Seeing Lionel's nonchalant response, the 3 didn't know how to respond. Was this a way that someone who had just died was supposed to react? Lionel, however, was already thinking of other things. This monument wasn't suitable for him. It was too bloodthirsty, and also the general it depicted used a halberd. In truth, the halberd and spear had many similarities, but Lionel had the spear domain to learn everything he needed about the spear. He didn't need outside resources. He needed to visit the other monuments and hopefully find something that would make his breakthrough into the 4th dimension with his soul force allow him to protect himself. Lionel was mostly hoping to find a 4th dimensional mage. If he couldn't find it within the eastern section of the city, he would have to travel to the other sections even if it meant starting a war. Jirak, Sil and Kyra obviously had no idea what Lionel was thinking, otherwise, who knew how they'd react to this madman? Chapter 364. As much as Lionel wanted to ignore everything else around him and focus on the monuments, there was only so long he could dodge Sil. Not long after Lionel found out the truth about the monuments and was planning on traveling through them one by one, the remaining 7 members of the Kiafur family selections finally made it through the gates. Aside from the petite girl who had confronted Lionel initially, who became a royal, the rest were either generals or soldiers. With all of them now here, Lionel couldn't continue to stall Sil and had no choice but to follow her through the eastern sector and into the more luxurious regions. "Jirak, why are you following us?" Sil said, seemingly a bit displeased. Apparently, she still hadn't forgotten about the words Jirak had said to take advantage of her earlier. "Wherever Lionel goes, I go," Jirak said matter-of-factly. Lionel didn't refute this. If things went south, Jirak was maybe the only protection he had. He was under no delusions that he would be able to handle Sil's elder brother on his own. Unless Era had a way to contact her husband, it was unlikely that the Kiefer family heir was even aware of Lionel's existence. And Lionel had a bad feeling that Era wanted it this way. Lionel wasn't oblivious. He knew of the underhanded tricks Era was pulling behind the scenes. One of the things he was best at was reading people. And he wasn't new to women being fond of him. As a 5-star quarterback, there were plenty of women, even those from noble families, who were willing to throw themselves at him. Even though the occupation wasn't as respected, that was only a matter of relativity. Not every woman would be able to find a husband from a 5-star profession of high standing. And, as a quarterback, Lionel was guaranteed to become a very rich man in the future. This was all to say that Lionel could easily read the signs of women coming on to him. It was just easier to pretend to be ignorant. But, by now, Lionel realized that if he allowed things to continue like this without stepping in properly, a small misunderstanding could easily become a massive one. The worst part was that he couldn't just step out and say he had feelings for another woman. He was quite familiar with women, and saying such a thing bluntly would only make him public enemy number 1. Please come back soon. Lionel looked up into the sky, holding back crocodile tears. Things would be so much easier if Aina was here, even if she was still pretending to not like him. Lionel suddenly smiled. That's all right, I know you've already fallen for me. Sil and Jirak looked toward Lionel's suddenly smiling face, wondering just what he was thinking about. At that moment, the surroundings began to change. From dirt roads and tents, they began to see neat little huts amid smooth roads. Soon, those smooth roads became paved in stone and the huts became small houses of brick. Even now, one couldn't say these homes were luxurious. They were quite minimalistic compared to true behemoths one might find in the outside world. However, in this place, where the only building taller than 3 stories was the massive tower that connected the sectors, this was by far the best place to live. Each home was gated and had a different style, exuding a different aura. Some reminded Lionel of gentle winds, others of rushing water, and still others like raging flames. However, what each house had in common was a single lamppost before its gate. It only took a moment for Lionel to understand that if this lamppost was lit, the house had been claimed. If it hadn't been, then the lamppost wouldn't be. Judging by the current situation, there were much more homes lit than Lionel thought there would be. Were there really this many emperors? Sil hesitated for a moment. Though she knew her brother would be here, she wasn't exactly sure where he would be. You don't want to choose a house? Jirak suddenly asked, glancing toward Lionel. Not yet. Lionel shook his head. Jirak laughed. If I was as weak as you, I'd be hesitant too. Lionel chuckled in response, not minding. How'd it feel to lose to someone so weak? Sil giggled, forgetting about her task to find her brother for a moment. Just as the group was about to continue through to see if they could find any clues, Lionel frowned. He turned back to find a young man strolling through the stone-paved roads. He wore white robes that shifted slightly with his every step. His long, black hair was neatly tied, making it almost impossible to make out individual strands. Everything about him exuded an air of refinement and cleanliness, almost like a diligently polished blade ready to be unsheathed. Sil noticed Lionel's odd reaction and turned back. Her eyes lit up in pleasant surprise. Big brother. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He hadn't expected to run into this man so easily. And, most importantly, he hadn't expected that even after overestimating his potential abilities in his mind, that Lionel would still be so surprised by the pressure he felt from this young man. As Lionel was looking toward the Kiefer family heir, he too was looking toward Lionel. The young heir had never met Lionel before, he didn't know who he was either, but he still felt his eyes gravitate toward him. And, when he noticed the emperor mark that barely shrouded the black brand between his brows, he felt inwardly surprised. For a moment, he forgot to respond to his sister. A sword that hung to his back vibrated slightly, making it seem as though the blade might unsheath at any moment. This was the first time Lionel noticed the sword. His vision had been so focused on the young man before him. However, after a moment, he realized why he hadn't. The sword wasn't attached to anything. It floated in the air, following the young man around as though it couldn't bear to part with him. Lionel couldn't imagine the level of skill that was needed to reach such a state. Chapter 365. The atmosphere grew silent. Syl seemed to realize that something was wrong when she saw her brother and Lionel staring down one another. But any words she wanted to speak seemed completely caught in her throat. She felt that she couldn't form the things she wanted to say no matter how hard tried. Shing! 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 The sword to the young heir's back continued to tremble. Some unknown force held it back from unsheathing. Lionel continued to silently watch, sizing up the young man in white before him. Lionel knew too little about the fourth dimension to accurately gauge strength. But he could sense pressure easier than maybe anyone else. Even though this young heir was weaker than Uncle Zimo, considering his youth, Lionel had no doubt that there would come a day when Zimo was completely overshadowed. Suddenly, the pressure dispersed. The young heir looked from Lionel to his little sister and smiled lightly. Though the smile was a bit cold, it was filled with a doting air to it. Syl, you're here. The young man nodded. And who is this? Syl shook her head to recover. Sister-in-law recommended him. He's participating as one of us. His name is Lionel Morales. Morales. The young man frowned. He felt something stir within him as his thoughts drifted toward a certain memory. But he didn't remain in a trance for long. The universe was too big, those sharing the same name were far too numerous. Of course, those who were on the same level as certain families wouldn't dare to share the same name. For example, there was no way someone on terrain would take the Kiafur family name. Such a person would be asking for death. However, there might very well be other fourth-dimensional worlds where the Kiafur name was used. The influence of the Kiafur family wasn't large enough to instill that kind of fear. This was all to say that it was a matter of perspective. And, to put this matter into perspective, the fact that this young heir even paused at this name meant that his scope was already far beyond those usually found on the fourth-dimensional plane. A higher dimensional world wouldn't care what ants beneath them did. But the young heir knew that if by some miracle this Lionel Morales really made it to such a height, he would definitely have to change his name unless he wanted to be hunted down and executed. This matter was definitely not as rare as it seemed, and no small number of stubborn individuals had suffered. However, the young heir didn't bother to tell all of this to Lionel. Such a thing was far too distant in the future, and the likelihood that Lionel would ever reach such a level was slim to none. The young heir nodded. So Era decided this. The young heir was quite familiar with his wife, so he had a good idea of what she was thinking. But, taking care of someone in the third dimension, no matter how talented they were, would be difficult. Even he didn't dare to enter Brave City until he had grown to a certain level of strength. Is there a reason the Black City heir is here? Syl's elder brother asked. Jirak snorted. The only difference between me and you is that you're a bit older. Is there a need to stick your nose so high into the sky? Still, even the usually boisterous Jirak didn't dare to say these words aloud. Though this young heir seemed refined, anyone who had heard of history knew that he was a madman. He's with me. Lionel replied, seemingly noticing Jarek's apprehension. Oh. The young heir didn't ask anything further. The situation right now is a bit delicate. The trials will begin in another month, but that doesn't mean the city is safe. In fact, this is maybe the most dangerous time. There's a good chance that a territorial war could be sparked. Lionel scratched his nose, pretending as though he didn't plan on being responsible for starting one. Be sure to stay within the limits of the eastern sector. And, if you are going to the central tower, travel in pairs. Also, be cautious of the monuments. Lionel's eyes narrowed when he heard this, but didn't say anything more, waiting for the young heir to finish his spiel. After a while, Lionel suddenly got curious about something. What benefits are there to a territorial war? There's got to be a reason for them, right? The young heir swept a glance over Lionel. Not many dared to cut him off while he was speaking like this. Of course, that was just the young heir's illusion. Lionel had waited for a slight pause in his long-winded admonishment. It was clear that the young heir was lecturing his little sister rather than speaking for all of their benefits, so Lionel asked a question instead. There are 8 sectors to the city. Each has their own residential area and monuments. The only way to access the other sectors is through the central tower. However, due to this, it also makes it very obvious when someone is crossing over to a sector they shouldn't be in. When you enter another sector, it becomes easier to upgrade your rank, meditating before the monuments becomes easier, and the benefits for stealing abodes is also greater. Benefits of abodes? Lionel's gaze sparkled. Yes, every abode makes it easier to cultivate a specific special force. The short of it is that all benefits are greater when stealing them from another sector. But, for this reason, people are also very territorial. Considering your strength, acting on this would only lead to your death. The young heir's words were quite pointed, but Lionel didn't really care to respond directly to them. Lionel found this young heir to be quite odd. At first glance, he seemed stoic, cold and quiet, but he was actually quite long-winded. I have one more question. Lionel pressed. Are there really this many emperors? Lionel looked around at all the lit lampposts. It couldn't be that emperors were so cheap, right? Who said an emperor could only claim one house? Lionel's eyes widened. So this was how it was. Thanks for the help. Lionel said with a smile. I'll help out the Kiafur family if I can. I'll be going now. After finishing his duties, Lionel bid his farewells. His thoughts were filled with how to make his imprint as big as possible. If he wanted to be known, there was no better option than attacking other territories. However, Sil's brother wasn't wrong, he was too weak to do so now. He needed a few backup plans first. The young heir's gaze narrowed as he watched Lionel's back retreat, his sword trembling once again. Jirak followed along quickly, not knowing anything about the crazy thoughts going on in Lionel's head. Chapter 366. Hey, hey. Jirak jogged to keep up with Lionel, his heavy armor causing the paved roads to quake. Lionel looked back and couldn't help but smile. You know, for someone with such a strong wind affinity, shouldn't you wear something lighter than this, Baldy? Who knows, your hair might grow back if you stop straining yourself so much. What do you know? Jirak snapped like a cat that had its tail stepped on. Clearly, his baldness was a soft spot. It's precisely because I have a high wind affinity that I should take full advantage of it. Who else could wear such heavy army and yet still be so fast? Lionel shook his head and didn't reply to these words. They sounded logical, but the truth was that Jirak's speed would never reach its full potential like that. Just from what Lionel could see alone, he would easily be 2 or 3 times faster if he took his armor off. On top of that, he would never be as sturdy as someone with an earth affinity either. So, he was essentially becoming decent at many things in exchange for losing out at being excellent in one lane. In a world where your life was on the line at every turn, Lionel felt that this was a mistake. But, he didn't press Jirak too much. He still needed a bodyguard, after all. So who are you really? Jirak asked curiously, leveling out his steps with Lionel. I told you already, Lionel Morales. Lionel replied casually, looking toward the next monument. You know that's not what I mean. You use a translator, so you're obviously not from this world. I hear you came out of the same carriage as Sil, but you both deny being betrothed. You should probably hide that from that madman, by the way. If he finds out that something like that happened, he might kill you for defiling his little sister. Jirak rambled. I'm from Earth. Lionel finally responded as Jirak had a pause. Earth? Jirak's steps stopped. Lionel frowned, looking back toward Jirak. Is there a problem? No. Chirac shook his head. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Was there a need for such an exaggerated reaction? Terrain was just as bad a name as Earth, after all. It could be said that all their ancestors needed some better naming sense. Lionel wanted to say something about Jarrek's weird reaction, but he realized that they had already made it to the first monument. On the way to the Emperor abodes, Lionel had already mentally marked the locations of a few monuments. Unfortunately, Lionel was so focused on the monuments before him and how they could help him find Aina that he had completely missed the complicated gaze Chirac looked toward his back with. After a full day, Lionel fell into his thoughts, organizing everything he had seen. The eastern sector had 33 monuments and Lionel had been to them all. However, there were only a minority of them that caught Lionel's attention at all. The first one was of a bowman. Unlike what Lionel had with his spear domain, he didn't have a set path to follow with his bow. However, it would be a shame to ignore his talent for marksmanship. The only issue was finding sources that could help him continuously increase his skill. Of all 33 monuments he had been to, only one of them depicted a bowman. Even now, Lionel could remember her valiant aura and golden armor. She looked like a goddess descended toward earth. Just from the few scenes Lionel saw, he could tell that she could control the flow of a 10-kilometer radius just with her bow and arrows alone. It was a level of skill Lionel couldn't even imagine in his current state. The second monument that caught Lionel's attention was of another woman. The only unfortunate part was that she was a fire mage and not an earth or light mage. Lionel still remembered being entranced. This woman stood in the skies wearing a fiery red robe so long it extended tens of meters past her feet. Her fiery red hair was of an obscene length as well, whipping about like rays of crimson amidst the clouds. The domain that surrounded her seemed burnt to ash. The air was dry, the ground was black, the wind was scorched. It felt as though one was standing in a perpetual hell just being around her. Lionel remembered being in awe when he came out from the illusion before soon being disappointed. After all, he wasn't a fire mage. And, even though he had dream sculpted all the mage arts of Camelot, regardless of element, he had never even so much as used a fire element spell before. However, that was when something shocking happened. Lionel realized that when he looked around him, Chirac and the others who had surrounded the monument at the time had separated their distance to him by a large margin. At first, Lionel had been confused, but when he looked around, he found that there was a radius of scorched ground around him. In fact, the only things not burnt to ash near him was the little mink napping on his head without any worries and, luckily, his clothes. It was then that Lionel came to realization. His Scarlet Star Force. Top 10 amongst star elemental forces. Top 3 amongst light elemental forces. N. The very best amongst fire elemental forces. Without realizing it, Lionel's affinity for fire magic had surpassed his affinity for both earth and light elemental magic. Whether it was his metal synergy or snowy star owl lineage factors, they were all overshadowed by his innate force node. This could only be expected, after all, a lineage factor is passed down and must be slowly unlocked, whereas an innate force node was all to a person's own. Of course, Lionel's Scarlet Star Force also vastly improved his light and star element affinity. Compared to others with light and star elemental affinity, Lionel was amongst the very top few now. However, even compared to that increase, his fire affinity still gained the greatest leap. Even though he couldn't use his innate force node to its full potential now, simply by virtue of having it, all flames in the world bowed down to him. Chapter 367. The third monument that caught Lionel's attention was actually a sword-wielding man. However, this wasn't because of the weapon. Lionel had no interest in switching from the spear. In fact, he found that he was growing more and more fond of the spear every day. There were two reasons this monument caught his attention. For one, Lionel recognized a part of its aura. When he thought about it, he realized that it was very similar to the aura he had sensed on Syl's elder brother. Of course, The aura on Sill's elder brother was far weaker than the one Lionel sensed from this monument. However, it was the same aura nonetheless. As the saying went, it was important to understand one's enemy. Though Sill's brother wasn't yet at such a point with Lionel, Lionel had too much PTSD from organizations he joined betraying him. By this point, he was already on his guard and was preparing for the worst-case scenario. That said, if it was only about understanding Sill's elder brother, Lionel wouldn't be so interested in this monument. After all, no matter how much he understood the young heir, it was useless if he was too weak to do anything about it. Ultimately, what was most important was his own strength. However, there was a second matter that caught Lionel's attention. The sword-wielding man had a pair of wings. Lionel hadn't spent much time comprehending Golden Feather's step just yet. But he already understood just how important movement was in battle, especially if he was the weaker party. If one was far weaker in strength but had speed, there would always be a chance for survival. However, there were plenty of examples of stronger individuals suffering at the hands of those much faster than them. This was part of the reason Lionel didn't agree with Jarek's methods. Speed kills. What was exceptionally beautiful about this monument was that this winged swordsman placed emphasis on his speed. His movements and swords were fluid, moving together as one. The flaps of his weapon and the swings of his sword almost looked like breathing. The contraction of the diaphragm, the expansion of the lungs, the suction of air, the relaxing of the diaphragm, the shrinking of the lungs, the expelling of air, in a continuous cycle, they flowed into one another, nurturing one another, strengthening one another. Even compared to the other monuments Lionel had lost himself in, he spent an exceptionally long time at this one despite the fact he was only trying to hop from monument to monument as quickly as possible. It was thanks to this that Lionel realized something else: his dreamscape battle sense was missing. He didn't have enough fluidity. Right now, his battle sense worked by sensing a change and reacting to it. But that was entirely reliant on his opponent doing something. What if Lionel ran into a patient opponent who shared a similar battle style? How would his battle sense react when it had no information to read? Unfortunately, Diane could only store such thoughts in the back of his mind. Even this most simple version of his battle sense used up so much stamina, he couldn't imagine what would happen if he tried to add fluidity. He couldn't even wrap his mind around how he would do this. Still, this matter of fluidity taught Lionel something most could only learn after experiencing countless battles. Movement wasn't just about evading and defense, it was just as important in attacking. Only when one's steps flowed with one's actions seamlessly would one reach true mastery of their movement. Lionel was exceptionally lucky to grasp this truth before he truly began to study Golden Feather Step. It might even have the time he would need to master this technique. These were the three monuments that had caught Lionel's attention. This was a good result. Unfortunately, there was bad news. After Lionel studied all the monuments, he realized that he had been mistaken. There were no hidden techniques to learn or grasp. This meant that there were no fourth-dimensional techniques Lionel could learn to help make use of his soul force. All the monuments seemed entirely focused on aura and feel, as though it was teaching the disposition a warrior of a certain type should have. However, there were no techniques to glean from them at all. Such a reality left Lionel sighing. There are important lessons to learn, but that's about it. Lionel shook his head. These things weren't as useless as he thought. For example, the core lesson of the winged swordsman would lay a foundation for him in movement techniques that would only exponentially multiply in the future. If Lionel was correct, there were lessons to be gained from the bowman, or bowwoman, rather, and the fire mage as well. The bowwoman likely taught about control and the fire mage definitely touched upon the concept of a domain. Still, all of these things sounded nice, but now Lionel didn't have an obvious path toward improvement. Without matching techniques, breaking into the fourth dimension wouldn't create as great a boost to his strength as he would like. Lionel looked up to the sky and sighed. It seemed that things wouldn't be as easy as he thought. He needed to talk to the dictionary to arrange his thoughts. After a while, Lionel grit his teeth. He would have to risk it. The only place he would feel safe using the dictionary was in his own protected abode. He would have to put it all on the line and claim one now. If he let things stay as is, he would eventually suffer. Hesitancy and inaction were just as bad as failing miserably at times. Lionel could feel many eyes on him. Many had been watching his every action for a long time now, wondering how long he could hold out. When everyone saw him walking back toward the abode setting, numerous spies sent to monitor his actions rushed back toward their masters, cold lights flickering in their gazes. Jirak, who had followed Lionel all this time, frowned deeply. He couldn't help but look toward Lionel's side profile. Was he really going to do it now? Chapter 368. Lionel walked along the stone-paved roads once again, calmly observing the abodes and lampposts one by one. He was easily able to see which abodes could help with what. Most were focused on the main elements of fire, wind, earth, and water. Aside from them, there were a few rarer kinds that fell into the category of variants. The best sort of abode for Lionel would be a star elemental abode. Only such a place would be highly compatible with him and would make the process of evolving his soul force much smoother. Also, since he wasn't necessarily restricted to one abode, a metal variant of the earth element would also be greatly beneficial to him. This would help him improve his metal body at a much quicker rate. That said, this wasn't at the forefront of Lionel's mind. After all, he had long since realized that the aura beneath the gates and monuments could also work to greatly speed up the strengthening of his metal body. In fact, since the aura beneath the monuments were 10 times more concentrated, they were even better than the gates had been. Lionel continued to walk, quickly getting a bit worried. He saw some variant abodes, but he still hadn't seen a star force abode. What are you looking for? Jirak finally couldn't hold back. In his mind, after seeing how devastating Lionel's fire affinity was, Lionel should have long since chosen an abode. They had already passed by 2 fire elemental abodes and 1 variant fire elemental abode. Of course, Jirak had no idea that Lionel had yet to consciously work on his fire affinity before. I'm looking for a star force abode. Lionel replied. There was no need to hide anything anyway, since once he found such an abode, practically everyone would know about it. Star force? Jirak was shocked again. It was difficult to explain just how rare those with star affinity were. They were even on par with those that had enigmatic affinities like time and space. Star force was the only force in existence that could be cultivated and used no matter the environment. There were many locations in the universe where energy of a certain kind became scarce and impossible to sense. Those who had such affinities that were unlucky enough to end up in such regions could only lament their bad luck and hope to survive. In such environments, even abilities could become useless. However, no matter where one was, there would always be star, space and time force. These 3 forces and the other rare ones like it all had this fundamental reason that set them apart. Suddenly, Jirak laughed. No wonder, no wonder. I thought you were a madman for a second, but it seemed you had a plan too. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? You don't have to act ignorant anymore, I see through you. Lionel frowned in confusion. No, really. Jirak gave Lionel a weird look. You really don't know? Really? Madman. Just a madman. Jirak grumbled. Claiming an abode requires 2 prerequisites. The first is that you must have the appropriate rank. It's possible for an emperor to claim a king's house, but it isn't possible for a king to claim an emperor's unless they upgrade their mark. The second prerequisite is that the trial of the abode must be passed. Lionel's gaze suddenly brightened, his steps coming to a halt. You mean to say that the trial that must be passed is related to the affinity of the abode? So, if I'm the only one with star force affinity. If you're the only one with star force affinity, then it would be impossible for anyone to claim your abode other than you unless they're seeking death. The trials are quite simple if you share the necessary affinity, and you can muddle your way through variant affinities as long as it's related to your main affinity. However, if you try to claim a home you have no affinity with, heavy injury is the best case scenario. Lionel's gaze brightened like 2 torches. Was this what they called luck? Was he finally going to get something to go his way? Lionel was a virgin and hadn't even kissed a woman before. In fact, the only times he had even been able to touch Aina somewhat intimately was when she was either unconscious or half dead. But he could swear that being with a woman couldn't possibly feel half as good as he was feeling right now. He almost shed real tears. Jirak gave Lionel another odd look. Why does he look so happy? Why does his expression almost look lewd? Jirak almost began to shed his own tears. He could only hope that Lionel didn't use his control over his life to take his chastity. Of course, if others knew Jirak was thinking himself as chaste, he'd probably be stoned to death. After a moment of happiness, Lionel regained his composure. Even if these people couldn't try to seize his abode, the fact of the matter would be that he would still be unsafe when he left his abode. And he would have no choice but to leave it if he wanted to make his name known to find Aina. In addition, it wasn't like he could bring the monuments into his abode either. However, this was still the greatest news he had heard in a long while. Even if he would still be at risk, he wouldn't have to worry about the 12-hour limit anymore. In addition, should things go south, he had a safe house he could return to. Of course, this was as long as no one else had a star affinity. Soon, Lionel and Jirak made it to the end of the stone-paved roads. For a moment, Lionel thought he had dropped back down to an abyss because even now, he couldn't find a star affinity abode. But that was when his gaze landed on 6 homes that sat side by side. In fact, they were a measure larger than all the other homes. One gave off a radiant gold light. The next pulsed with darkness. The third seemed warped, dilating one's sense of time. The fourth seemed to stand in a plane of its own. It looked as though it was right before them, yet hundreds of miles away at the same time. The fifth made Lionel exceptionally excited. It, too, exuded a light. But it was more gentle and dense than the first, not to mention warmer. This was definitely a star affinity abode. Finally, his heart rested easy. However, when he looked at the 6th house, Lionel's steps froze again as he fell into a daze. He felt as though he experienced his whole life once again. From the day he was born to this very moment right here. In his shock, Lionel saw the image of a woman gorgeous beyond words. It was the kind of beauty that seized the heart and overshadowed even young Mistress Era. She had eyes as bright as glistening emeralds, hair like a shimmering golden white waterfall, and a smile that made tears uncontrollably fall from Lionel's eyes. She held a baby in her arms, her gaze a mixture of love and unwillingness. The image was so real that Lionel felt as though he was right there. He was the baby. He was the one being looked at in such a way. Mom. Lionel had never said these words in his life. At least, he had never said it to address another person. He never thought about his mother because he couldn't even remember her. He couldn't say he felt one way or another. But, at this moment, he felt as though his heart was bleeding. How could he forget that gaze? When Lionel snapped out of it, he found himself standing in the same place staring at the same house. Lionel. Oh, you're awake. Try not to stare at that abode too much. There've been stories of others never being able to extricate themselves. I've never heard of someone falling into a trance like you did coming out. You're very lucky. Lionel blinked, trying to regain his bearing. But the tears didn't seem to want to stop. That abode, what is it? Lionel forced out, his voice shockingly steady. That? Jirak didn't even dare to look toward the abode as he referred to it. They call it Dream Force. Chapter 369. The moment Lionel heard these words, he felt his mind tremble. After a moment, he wiped the tears from his eyes and shook his head. Lionel's personality was one that was difficult to grasp. It was hard to imagine that a person who seemed so soft-hearted as him wouldn't even spare a single thought toward his mother. It wasn't rare for children who grew up with one or no parents to have fanciful images of what could have been. Of course, some grew out of this phase while others never did. However, maybe very few were like Lionel and never had such thoughts at all. This was maybe one of Lionel's true faces. Though he loved, he also had a deeply calculating side to him. When he told his former best friend James that he would leave Aina alone if she truly rejected him, he hadn't been lying. If the words no ever came out of her mouth or her actions ever made him feel as though she was rejecting him, he wouldn't hesitate to let that part of his heart die. Lionel knew this about himself. Maybe if it wasn't for the love he gained from his father, he could have very well become someone's cold-killing tool. There really wasn't much separating such a person from himself aside from his upbringing. To now, maybe Lionel had subconsciously accepted that his mother didn't want him, so he very logically cut off that part from himself. There was no need to waste time thinking about someone who had no need for him. However, the moment he saw that gaze, everything suddenly changed for Lionel. As logical and calculating as Lionel was, he was just as loving and caring. If the gaze his mother had for him was still the same, then no matter where she was, what trouble she was in, what was keeping her from his side, he would make sure to wipe it all out. It was that simple to Lionel. There was nothing more to think about. Jirak suddenly felt that suffocating aura once again. He could hardly move until Lionel finished going through his thoughts. What is dream force? Lionel suddenly asked, his heart growing calm. Lionel needed to know. Was it just coincidental? Or was there a reason behind everything? Jirak hesitated. The Dream Force abode was an extremely enigmatic existence. According to what Jirak knew, it didn't appear all of the time. It would often hide itself as though it was an illusion and rarely appeared. However, the times it did appear usually led to tragedy. There were no small number of geniuses who had lost themselves in an illusion just staring at it. It could be said that Jirak was lucky to not be one of them. He had been observing Lionel this whole time because he thought he was a madman. But then, Lionel suddenly stopped and entered a daze. This luckily triggered some of Jirak's memories, so he didn't dare to look where Lionel was looking. But, from what Jirak knew, it should have been impossible for Lionel to wake up. Yet, not only had Lionel woken up, he had only been in a daze for a few seconds at most. This left Jirak more shocked than almost anything else ever could. Could it be that all those legends were exaggerated? They must be. Despite thinking this, though, Jirak still didn't dare to look toward the sixth abode. It's another high-level force. Wherever there are people, there will be dream force. So, in a way, just like how star force is never restricted by location, so is dream force. After all, if you happen to find yourself in such a place, as long as you exist, there will be dream force. But what is it exactly? Lionel asked, his expression having regained an eerie calm. He almost seemed too placid. I don't know much about it. I only heard someone once describe dream force as the representation of consciousness. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Consciousness. How much effort had the scientists of Earth put into finding the source of human consciousness? It was the one thing that even hundreds of years of technological advancement still couldn't describe. Some believed that human consciousness was stored in a soul or spirit. Others believed that everything that represented consciousness could be found within the brain and that we only couldn't describe it because we didn't understand the brain well enough. When Lionel entered this new world order, he sometimes had fleeting thoughts that maybe a soul did exist. He had seen so many fantastical powers in the past year that this was much easier to accept for him. Yet, even now, he had yet to find this so-called soul of his. One had to know that soul force was just a name. It didn't represent a spiritual form of Lionel. It was simply an extension of Lionel's senses, another form of energy. Nothing more, nothing less. This was the reason why, even though Lionel knew his ethereal glabella inside and out, he had never run into anything like a soul in there. All one could find were his embryos and his stars. There was nothing else. But what Jirak was saying now was that this dream force represented such a thing. It left Lionel feeling, well, he wasn't exactly sure how he was feeling at all. All Lionel knew was that this was the abode he would be choosing. He didn't even hesitate as he took a step toward it. Jirak panicked. Hey, what are you doing? Lionel smiled lightly. Choosing an abode, obviously. You're going in the wrong direction. The star abode is over there. Lionel smiled but didn't reply. Jirak knew well what he was doing. Whether it was dangerous or not, Lionel didn't care. He needed to know why his heart was thumping like this. It was the same feeling Lionel had felt when he chose Dimensional Cleanse. It was the same feeling he had when he chose Golden Feather Step. Yet, it was several times more potent than the feeling had ever been. Were those names he chose a coincidence? Dream World. Dream Sculpt. Dreamscape. Dream Clone. How much of it was a casual name he had given his abilities and how much of it was something compelling him toward the right path? Lionel had always believed that his ability and his soul force was inextricably linked. But, what if this wasn't entirely correct? What if he was missing something? Lionel took several more steps, ignoring Jirak's attempts to stop him. Eventually, the poor bald Jirak, scared for his own safety, didn't dare approach the house any closer. Though he could stop Lionel by force with his strength, he could see a look in Lionel's eye that made him not dare to do so. Then, Lionel crossed the threshold no one else dared to. What he didn't know was that his actions would soon cause an uproar. Chapter 370. Lionel was suddenly bombarded by a surge of force. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The force he was used to was hard to sense, but it was still tangible. Even someone with weak internal sight could feel it as long as the concentration was high enough. But, this force, despite being maybe in the highest concentration Lionel had ever seen, still felt unreal. The harder Lionel tried to reach out to it, the more fluidly it slipped through his fingers. It was as though Lionel was on a different plane, observing it from afar. However, despite there being such a surge, Lionel didn't feel like his life was in danger at all. In fact, he continued to walk forward without suffering any setback at all. If it wasn't for the fact he was taking his time to sense the mysteriousness of this dream force, he would have already long since crossed this trial. Before Lionel even realized it, he had made it to the door of the dream force abode. His palm reached out, touching the dark oak of the door. A light clicking sound reached Lionel's ears as the door slowly swung open. At that moment, a shield of protection suddenly vibrated. The lamppost that manned the outside flickered before erupting into a blinding light that shot into the skies. The eyes of numerous elites swung in a single direction. They were all used to the signs of an abode being conquered by now. However, the signs had never been this exaggerated before. In the whole of Terrain's brave city, not a single one had ever claimed one of these special abodes. Lionel, however, had no idea that he had suddenly become the center of attention. He was entirely immersed in an all-new feeling. His body, despite standing on the ground, felt as though it was soaring into the clouds. When Lionel finally snapped out of his odd state, he was uncertain of how much time had passed. But, he was no longer worried about a time limit. Compared to the Star Force abode, this Dream Force abode was even more secure. Whereas someone bold might try to force their way through the Star Force trial, Lionel didn't believe anyone would have the guts to do so with the Dream Force abode. Facing something tangible was always easier than facing the illusory. In this abode, it was possible to fall into an illusion without even realizing what happened. If it wasn't for Lionel's high affinity with Dream Force, he would have likely fallen into an endless cycle as well. So that's how it is. Lionel exhaled a long breath, looking around his new home for the next while. He couldn't help but smile. He hadn't had a place he could call home in more than a year now. He didn't know how long he would be in this brave city, but he definitely felt at home here. The whole abode was decorated in white and black. The two shades complemented and danced with one another across the home. It was warm and pleasing to the eye, leaving Lionel feeling content. For the first time, Lionel didn't feel the need to ask the dictionary what was happening with him. He understood that compared to his affinity for fire, light, star, or earth, his affinity for Dream Force existed on a completely different plane of its own. It was so high, in fact, that even without being consciously aware, he had still made use of it before, whenever Lionel entered his dream world, whenever he used Dream Sculpt, whenever he formed a dream clone. Every time, without fail, without dream force as a core, he would have failed. To use something so unconsciously, as though he was breathing, just what level of affinity was that? But, now that Lionel knew what it was and could consciously put it into motion, whoosh! A violent torrent of force surged toward Lionel. He completely expelled all of his normal soul force. It was nothing but a hindrance to him, limiting his abilities and causing him to use more stamina to perform tasks that should have been as easy as breathing. To Lionel, soul force and dream force were like the lubricants and fuel to a well-running engine. Not only was soul force far lower in quality, when it combusted, it gave off countless impurities, making its efficiency horrid. Not everyone could do as Lionel was currently doing. Dream force represented consciousness. Those with low affinity could easily lose themselves, forgetting what was real and what was not. Their memories would become so real that it would feel as though they were reliving them in real time. Their phobias would manifest and hold control of them. Even their loves would become larger than life, enveloping their very beings. The number of pitfalls there were to using dream force were endless. Only those innately born with a comprehension of this force could make use of it without losing themselves. And, thanks to his ability, Lionel just so happened to be one of these people. The moment all of his soul force was purged, Lionel felt as though a shackle on his mind had been lifted. Dream force began to compress within his ethereal glabella, wildly surging about. Lionel wasn't worried in the slightest. The dream force he was accepting now, no matter how high level of an energy it was still considered to be within the fourth dimension. With the strength of his mind, it was child's play to accept for him. Whoosh! The force around Lionel kicked up a tempest. Lionel's hair fluttered wildly, his heavy robes billowing. What sounded like shattering glass resounded in Lionel's ears. Lionel's eyes shot open, a bright light making his pale irises seem no dimmer than his mother's bright emerald gaze for a moment. Lionel felt that his mind had never been clearer. He saw the things in the world down to their most basic building blocks, seeing through the foundation even the most complex things with just a single glance. With a flip of his palm, the dictionary appeared once again. The last time Lionel checked the level of his ability, it had just barely crossed into the bronze grade. Though this was still a fifth-dimensional ability, with the other limiters on Lionel's body, it hadn't been able to truly shine. But now, ping, subject, Lionel Morales, calculative mind, an ability capable of simplifying the complex. Evaluating power, ping, evolution stage, quasi-silver. Chapter 371. Lionel should have been shocked by this result. After all, the last time he checked, his ability was graded as Tier 3 bronze. This sort of massive leap should have been completely out of expectations. But, Lionel only nodded. This much should have been expected. After purging his soul force, his ability should have already shot up to Tier 6 or 7. Then, after breaking through to the fourth dimension within his ethereal glabella, it shot up once again to quasi-silver. It was very likely that at this moment, he had the most powerful ability on terrain. Lionel closed his eyes, focusing on the changes to his ability. Lionel already knew that he wouldn't suddenly awaken new branches to his ability. His calculative mind ability entirely relied on himself to come up with new ways to use his computer-like brain. However, he could still check to see what improvements there had been to abilities he already created. My dream clone limit is now 17, this was the first thing Lionel realized as it was the easiest to quantify. 17 might sound like a small change, but it became exponentially more difficult to split his mind the more ways he did so. Of course, it was possible for Lionel to surpass this limit of 17 if he consciously lowered the computing power of each. But, in most cases, this wouldn't be very helpful. Lionel's overall abilities gained a massive boost. He could dream sculpt in a fraction of the time. The ideas he had to improve his dreamscape and dreamscape battle sense seemed to increase like a never-ending tide, but the most important change to Lionel was that he could see through the core secrets of the things he had dream sculpted. Lionel left his dream world and walked out of his abode. Jirak. Lionel called out. By now, Jirak was in a pitiful state. He didn't dare to look toward the abode, but he also felt conflicted in his heart. His pride wouldn't allow him to abandon Lionel. He hadn't been joking around when he said he would sign his life over. He was a real man. He refused to do anything that encroached on his ideals for himself. At that moment, Jirak had just been about to turn toward the abode. Even if he got stuck in an illusion for the rest of his life, he would have still have followed through on the thoughts of his heart. But, who knew that the moment he spun around, a vicious glint in his eyes as though the abode was his mortal enemy, he would hear Lionel's voice suddenly call out. Lionel looked toward Jirak with an amused expression. "What are you doing out there? Hurry up." Jirak stood rooted in place for a long while. Did I already fall into the illusion? Fuck, my life is over. Lionel laughed and shook his head. He hadn't had a close friend since James betrayed him. In fact, he had very much avoided it, closing himself off slightly. But, he felt it wouldn't be bad to have someone like Jirak around, at least for now. Lionel waved a finger, causing a pillar of earth to shoot up from behind Jirak and send him soaring toward the house. Ah! Jirak grabbed onto his ass with both hands, soaring through the skies with a wronged expression on his face. Lionel let Jirak land before the door. No way he was going to catch something so heavy. But, this seemed to wake Jirak up from his stupor. You really claimed this abode?" Lionel smiled. "I have some stuff to do before we go again. Just stay in here, it's safer. I'm sure there will be people surrounding this place soon enough." With that, Lionel turned and entered, walking up to the highest room of the abode. Though he didn't know Jirak well, his actions just now were enough for Lionel to take a chance on his character. Even if Lionel was wrong about him, with Lionel's current abilities, he could definitely stop anyone he didn't want spying on him from doing so. Jirak stood in a daze as Lionel disappeared. Bang! Someone tell me what the hell just happened. Within the central tower, numerous meetings just like this were taking place. As though by tacit understanding, almost all emperors and most kings not involved in Lionel's claiming of the dream abode came to this very place. Please calm your anger, young master. All those we've sent to investigate haven't come back. We're unsure of what happened as well. Damn it. The young man in question knew that he couldn't go and investigate himself. If he did so, that would be an act of war on the eastern sector and he couldn't bear this burden alone. It was fine if he sent middling soldiers out to do his bidding. Who would care about a few soldiers? They weren't enough of a threat to be taken seriously. But, if he, as a king, made a move of his own, it would definitely stir up some problems. The dream abode had been claimed. The dream abode has been claimed. At that moment, a soldier came sprinting into the tower, almost tripping over his own feet. The entire environment froze. Had it been the light or dark abode, it would have been shocking, but easier to accept. Had it been the star, space, or time abode, the whole of terrain would have been shaken, but it would still cool down after a while. But, for it to be the dream abode, it felt as though everyone had entered an illusory realm of their own. Did they really hear correctly? Rain-Red Solar, Jilnia Falls and Wheeless Mirage all sat together, discussing this very topic. But, when they heard the news, they too came to a grinding halt. Then, they all looked toward one another and understood something immediately. Their mission this time was far too important. It was so important that they even stopped personally overseeing the capture of that ugly bitch. For such a variable to appear now of all times, they had to find a way to deal with it. Chapter 372. Lionel had no idea about the commotion he had caused. But, truthfully, this was a matter of choice rather than one of ignorance. All he cared about at this moment was increasing his own strength. The question laid in how he would do so. At the moment, Lionel sat in the pool of his abode setting in a silent state of meditation. His mind rushed through several potential plans as he organized himself. The quickest way to improve himself was likely with the 4 Seasons Realm Force Arts of Merlin's trials. With the improvement to his ability added atop the help of the natural force art, it most definitely wouldn't take him the years he previously thought it would. Lionel had already done a quick estimate. It would take him about a single day to perfect dream sculpt one of them now. And, if he wanted to fuse his comprehensions of winter, spring, summer and fall, he felt it would take about a week or two. In total, if Lionel wanted to grasp the 4 seasons realm for his spear, bow and fists, it would take about 2 to 3 months. This was definitely a far shorter evaluation than he previously had. The only unfortunate part was that these wouldn't be his own comprehensions. As such, the power he displayed wouldn't be as exaggerated as allowing him to challenge the peak of the 4th dimension. For someone weak, the best thing they can do to keep themselves safe would be to have mobility and to keep a certain distance. Lionel knew this well. So, for now, he set aside the idea of comprehending his spear and fist techniques. During the trip here, Lionel had already completely grasped chain domain and conquered his first spear peak. There was no need to spend any more time on it for now. In fact, Lionel was leaning toward comprehending the 4 seasons realm with his spear on his own. But, this was still a matter for the future. Focus on movement and long-ranged attacks. When Lionel came to this conclusion, he had made up his mind. He was able to quickly break down the things he needed to do. The first and most obvious was to awaken the speed branch of his snowy star owl lineage factor. The second was to master golden feather step. The third was to comprehend and fuse his comprehensions of the 4 seasons realm for his bow embryo. And the fourth was to modify his use of Camelot's spell arts to make them useful against 4th-dimensional opponents. In the past, Lionel didn't have the computational ability to do this on his own. But, at the moment, he was feeling much more confident. Having made his decision, Lionel's eyes slowly opened. A smile crept onto his face as he watched the little mink float in the pool. The little guy snored away without a care in the world, causing Lionel to chuckle. Lionel entered his dream world once again. This time, he immediately split himself into 16 dream clones. Then, he assigned 4 to each one of his chosen tasks. As for his 17th dream clone, he had it completely focus on absorbing dream force. The only way to sustain such continuous activity would be to do exactly this. If Lionel was in any other environment, he would likely have to take a break every few hours. This had happened to him during his trip here in the carriage with Era. This was why Era could so clearly tell when he slipped into and out of his meditative state. But the dream abode had such a high density of dream force that Lionel didn't even need to worry about it. And, since he was currently within the segmented cube, he could allow it to slowly gain the characteristics of the dream abode as well. At least for while Lionel was within the 4th dimension and 4th-dimensional dream force was still helpful to him, he could enter the abode or lab setting to gain the same benefits he was now. Golden feather step, clones. After asking the dictionary, Lionel conjured up an environment perfect for training movement within his dream world. His dream clones each stood atop thin metal poles barely the width of the balls of their feet. Below, there was nothing but an endless abyss. In their minds, the movements of golden feather step were replayed again and again. Each of them tried to grasp the artistic conception of the technique. Lionel had no idea that his thoughts now were far beyond a normal person's. Artistic conception was usually a term reserved for the universe cycles. But, to try and paint a picture without even considering the universe cycles, the outcome would be quite interesting indeed. However, Lionel had always been doing this subconsciously. In the past, he had practiced chasing wind without even opening its cover. What was this if not relying on artistic conception? When Lionel chose golden feather step, what he chose wasn't its name or its power, he chose its feeling. Speed branch lineage factor clones. Lionel entered a deep introspection of his body, sensing the shackles that bound his blood. Having access to a particular branch didn't necessarily mean that one would awaken it. However, to now, Lionel had been able to awaken the first levels of both the healing branch and the wisdom branch. The first opening of the wisdom branch was known as blossoming mind. It opened up one's thoughts, increasing speed of thought and solidifying the foundation for further cultivation of the mind. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't gain much from this other than smoothing out his path toward the fifth dimension. After all, his own ability overshadowed any benefits one could gain from unlocking this first shackle. The first opening of the healing branch was known as instant recovery. As long as there was an adequate separation of time, Lionel could instantly recover back to his peak state. It had already been months since the last time Lionel used this ability, but he still had a few more months to go before he could use it again. Luckily, this opening of this branch had the passive ability of multiplying the impact of normal healing, something Lionel had experienced personally already during his battle with Lamorak. The first opening of the speed branch, however, was a special case for the snowy star owl. It had a slight mutation as compared to the normal speed branch of other lineage factors because it was tailored toward winged beasts. It was known as first flight. Chapter 373. Of course, Lionel wasn't going to sprout wings just by unlocking the first of his lineage factor's chains. Such a mutation would only occur at a much deeper level of integration. First flight represented the invocation of the essence of the snowy star owl's speed. For seasons clones, each one of Lionel's 4 dream clones focused on a different force art. They floated before his main body, each capturing a different scene. Despite the fact Lionel had already been bestowed the winter legendary skill, he still chose to comprehend it on his own again. It was then he suddenly realized something shocking. When he finally grasped winter on his own, he realized it was different from the comprehension Merlin's trial had bestowed to him. It can't be, Lionel froze for a moment. Compared to the comprehension Merlin's trial had given him, the one he comprehended by dream sculpting was several times deeper. In fact, Lionel felt as though he could sense the essence of the seasons as though it was his very own understanding. Lionel was stunned. What limited those who chose the second path of comprehension, relying on another, was that their understanding would never be as deep as the original creator. However, by dream sculpting these force arts, Lionel had integrated this understanding so deeply within himself that it almost felt like his own. Lionel was shocked to his core. When he realized this, he immediately consulted the dictionary. It was only after this that he finally calmed down. So that's how it is. Lionel learned from the dictionary that there were 2 things that distinguished the second and third forms of comprehension. The first was as Lionel thought, how deeply one comprehended. But the second was how much universal force one could evoke. Universal force was the strength behind the 4 seasons realm. When one comprehended one or all of the 4 seasons, it was possible to use universal force to increase one's strength. This was where the power of the realm came from. When one comprehended a universe cycle on their own, the amount of universal force one could use was far greater than when one relied on someone else. This essentially meant that Lionel was now in an in-between realm. He felt as though the comprehension was his own, but the universal force hadn't recognized it as such. As a result, the power he could evoke from the 4 seasons realm was more than someone who comprehended it with the help of another, but less than if he had comprehended it all on his own. Even though this wasn't as great as Lionel had been hoping, this was still excellent news. The second form of comprehension would have just been a minor boost to his strength, but this was much, much, much more of a boon. Lionel's confidence grew as he once more sunk back into his meditative state. Mage art clones. After the increased strength to Lionel's ability, he found that his ability to master force arts had skyrocketed. Not only could he draw mage arts much more quickly than he had in the past, he felt that he could even freelance their symbols to a small extent. Though freelancing lowered the strength of the art, it once again increased the casting speed and gave Lionel much more freedom in battle. However, what Lionel needed wasn't just speed, he needed added strength. There were 2 avenues he could travel down to accomplish this. The first was the layering art. Lionel had already used this art many times in battle. It allowed a mage to stack the same spell multiple times to increase its power. Unfortunately, it had its own limitations. For one, the maximum number of stacked spells for a 3-star magus art was 3 and no more. This wasn't anywhere near enough to harm a 4th-dimensional entity. In addition, the second problem was time. To layer multiple arts, it was obviously necessary to draw each one of them individually. This would increase casting time and not be conducive to battle. Of course, this second problem overshadowed the fact that it would also take a lot of stamina to layer so many arts. To Lionel, the problem of time and stamina wasn't really an issue. He could cast even a 3-star Magus art in a split second in his current state. The main issue was the limitation of the layering art. If Lionel wanted to go with this option, he would have to research into either making the layering art better or into making his 3-star Magus arts better complements to it. However, Lionel felt he had a much better idea than this. His 4 clones sat in regions of their own, each of them having numerous force arts floating around them. They spanned from the simplest apprentice arts to the highest Magus arts. Every so often, they would break down into smaller parts. Anyone watching from the outside would realize that it wasn't that there were apprentice arts and Magus arts floating around Lionel, but rather that the Magus arts were becoming apprentice arts. Lionel continued breaking down complex Magus arts into their simpler forms, forming them up once again. He seemed to be searching for something, looking for a path forward. Soon, there came a point where nothing but apprentice arts remained. Then, Lionel broke them down further. While Lionel was entirely focused on training himself, a month ticked by, then a second. Lionel had unknowingly turned 19, being completely none the wiser. Outside the dream abode, the crowd continued to grow. But, if one paid attention, it would become clear that for such a large crowd, the surroundings were eerily silent. In fact, not a single person was moving, as though they had all entered a trance. The higher-ups who sent all of their subordinates here felt a slight tinge of fear, all the legends of the dream abode coming back to their memories. If they weren't certain before, they were absolutely sure now that someone had claimed it. But, how could they deal with someone they couldn't even approach? It was only then that the crowd before the abode grew stagnant. From afar, the sight caused many to shudder in fear. While everyone was distracted, though, changes began to occur at the gates of Brave City once again. The first period of entry for Brave City was known as the quota period. In this period, every family, city, and power would only allow a certain number of individuals to enter. This was the calm state Brave City would be in during its active period, but it also only allowed a limited number of individuals to benefit. After this period ended, the second period would begin. During this time, restrictions would lift. But, the danger would multiply several folds. Whereas in the beginning, Brave City exuded a valiant majesty, it now seemed as though blood washed its walls. A suffocating killing intent hung around it, causing the weak to collapse and die beneath the pressure. No small number of individuals who overestimated themselves collapsed, never to breathe another breath. It was when this second period began that Xyler looked toward the massive looming gates with fists clenched and determination in his eyes. He wasn't the only one, but his will seemed to tower over the others. He still remembered Lionel's words that day, "Second place was never an option for me." Blood leaked from Xyler's fingers. "Second place isn't an option for me either." He took a firm step forward, his resolve forming a tangible shield around him. At that moment, approaching from the north, there was another who looked toward the bloody gates in silence. They had a back that hunched grotesquely and were shrouded in a black cloak. The scent of blood that hung around them seemed to rival even Brave City itself. Without hesitation, this figure too stepped forward. Chapter 374. Lionel slowly opened his eyes, exhaling a long breath. He didn't seem to look much different than he had just a few months ago. Lionel passed a hand across his face. He remembered that in his youth he had always wanted a full, connecting beard. But, ever since his hair changed, he had stopped growing facial hair. He couldn't decide whether this was a good or a bad thing. Regardless, if his facial hair came out as difficult to cut as his bronzed hair, it might be better that he never did. As things stood now, Lionel wasn't even sure if a full-force swing from Syl's elder brother's sword could cut his hair. It would probably only get worse when he entered the perfect stage. Lionel shuddered slightly, thinking about what it would mean if he had to take a blade with such force to his face. What would happen if I had to kiss Aina with such tough facial hair? Would I pierce her skin? Forget it, forget it. I'll just give up on that dream. Just like that, Lionel had gone from a youth who dreamed of having a full beard to one who would stay cleanly shaven for the rest of his life. Sometimes, the dream of a man could only die as he matured. Author's note: a moment of silence for our favorite MC. Lionel walked down the stairs of the dream abode. Not much had been touched in his absence, at least not on the second or third floors. It was only after he made it down to the first that he found Jirak. "You're finally out." Lionel gave Jirak a weird look. It wasn't because of what he said, but because of the enthusiasm he said it with. Was there a need to look so happy? Jirak's expression wasn't one of meeting a friend for the first time in a long time. It was more like he had just spent weeks in a bone-dry desert and finally found some water. The reaction was completely disproportional to the situation. "What's wrong?" Lionel asked. Jirak shook his head and stood up. At the moment, he was no longer wearing his heavy armor and had swapped it out for some lighter clothing. "I felt like I was going crazy. There's nothing to do in this house and I can't even cultivate. If I absorbed this dream force, I'd probably end up like all of them." Jirak pointed toward the curtained windows. The sun hardly shone through them at all, so it was impossible to see what was on the outside. But, clearly Jirak had taken a peek or two in the past. Hearing Jirak's words, Lionel felt a bit bad. He had brought Jirak in so that he would be safe. But, he had forgotten to consider that it would be difficult for Jirak to do much of anything here. With Lionel's protection, it wasn't a problem to stay here and not fall into an illusion. In fact, even if he did, Lionel could still pull him out of it. However, other than this, he was pretty limited. Lionel realized then that he might have been a bit too rash. It would have definitely been better for Jirak had he gone off to claim a king abode for himself. "Wait." Lionel shook his head. "What did you mean by that? Who's all of them?" Jirak smiled bitterly. "Check for yourself." Lionel slowly walked to the windows and pulled the curtain aside. When he saw what Jirak had already previously been aware of, he was speechless. What the hell, there was a sea of people outside his home. Though it wasn't as exaggerated as being within the hundreds, there were definitely more than a few dozen. If such a crowd appeared in a normal suburb of Earth, it would be enough to shake any homeowner. Yet, all of these people were frozen solid, not moving a single inch or saying a single word. "I guess the protections of this abode are even better than I thought. Let alone challenging it, they can't even look at it. Well, this definitely makes leaving easier." Lionel smiled. He had wanted to become known all this time so that Aina would know to come find him. So, to him, all this commotion was good news. Though he could awaken all these people, he had no reason to do so just yet. Without saying a word to Jirak, Lionel made his way to the door and swung it open. Hey. My armor. You don't need it." Lionel replied. "You." Jirak felt aggrieved, but his armor wasn't something he could put on in a split moment. It was extraordinarily heavy for him. "Come on. You're a wind affinity warrior, that armor is only hampering you." Lionel turned an eye toward Jirak that made the latter shudder. He felt as though Lionel had seen through him completely with that one glance. How'd he change so much? I need my armor," Jirak said. Lionel frowned. He hadn't expected Jirak to be so set on this. "Fine. Forget it." Jirak smiled somewhat, but it seemed forced as he hurriedly put his black armor back onto his body. It was only after he finished that he sighed a breath of relief as though he had been naked without it. Lionel nodded and they headed out of the door, not bothering to hide their presence much. Considering the current situation, it was already difficult enough to monitor them in the first place. Still, to no one's surprise, those kings and emperors had managed to find a loophole. If one was far enough away from the abode, the dream force couldn't affect them. Realizing this, Many left their scouts with special long-range sensory abilities in the central tower to monitor the dream abode from afar. The moment the doors swung open, they had all already been informed. But, by the time those gears had gotten into motion, Lionel had already made it to his first destination. The Monument of the Winged Swordsman. Chapter 375. The truth was that no one knew who it was had claimed the dream abode. It was only after seeing Lionel exit that people finally got a look at just who this individual was. So, when Lionel made it to the stone monument, not a single person spared him a glance. Of course, that was only because they didn't notice his emperor brand immediately. Now that Lionel knew his becoming famous was inevitable, he put away his overinflated bravado and went back to his normal disposition. So, not many eyes were on him to begin with. "Jirak, this monument is very useful for you," Lionel suddenly said. "Huh? What?" Jirak's eyes widened, then scanned the surroundings to see if anyone was listening in on their conversation. Lionel chuckled. "Don't worry, no one can hear me but you. It's just a single noise cancellation spell." Lionel had used plenty of these spells to form his maze back during Merlin's random event. Using it now in conversation wasn't an issue. That said, Lionel found that casting the same spells in a fourth-dimensional world had severely lowered effects. For example, a teleportation spell that would have usually carried him tens of meters would be lucky to shift him 1 or 2 meters. Still, for such a low-level spell, it could get the job done. It was only after hearing Lionel say this that Jirak sighed a breath of relief. "You're a mage?" "No, forget that." "What do you mean this monument can help me? Is there a secret?" "Of course there is. Did you think that these monuments just stood here to tell you about how many women these generals took back to their tents?" Jirak grinned. "What better source of encouragement is there than this?" Lionel seemed to have almost forgotten who he was dealing with. He almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. "The stories written on this monument may or may not be true, I don't know. But, what I do know is that the story isn't nearly as important as what's hidden within. You need to brace yourself and touch the monument with your internal sight." Jirak hesitated upon hearing this. The reason most didn't dare to do this was because the pressure around the monument was too great. Internal sight seemed intangible, but it was still connected to one's mind. Under equally intangible pressure, it could suffer damage and cause backlash to its owner. So, under such conditions, not many dared to even test Lionel's theory, let alone going as far as to observe the monument with it. "This is something you'll have to figure out yourself," Lionel said. "I've already given you all the information you need to know." Lionel sighed internally. He could tell that Jirak had a mental roadblock somewhere, but he wasn't some sort of guru, nor had he known Jirak for long enough to extend advice to him. Maybe to Jirak, he had already hidden it well. In truth, most wouldn't be able to pick up on it at all. The fact Lionel had was just a testament to his observational abilities. With these words said, Lionel took several steps forward and entered the aura field of the stone monument. It was only after he did this that many turned a curious eye over to him. An emperor. It had to be known that emperors and kings were almost all accounted for. Gathering information on such people was usually the topmost priority of anyone within these city walls. For them to not recognize such a person. Just who was he? The second phase had started not long ago. Could it be that there was someone hidden within the general population with such talent? No one here believed that they had really missed out on Lionel. It must be that he was new. And, if he was new, then that must be that he had entered without a quota during the second phase. And, by extension, that must be that he wasn't a part of the city lord structure or the powers. There was no way such a talent would be abandoned without a quota by such powers, right? But, wouldn't they have also known that a new emperor appeared? After all, there was only one gate in their eastern sector. As these people were trying to think about who Lionel might be, he had already crossed the 5-meter mark toward the stone monument, causing their eyes to almost bulge out from their sockets. It was no problem for an emperor to enter such a close range. The issue was doing it so quickly. It was as though Lionel wasn't even feeling any pressure to begin with. In the blink of an eye, Lionel had already become the closest to the stone monument. Yet, he didn't stop. He strolled forward, soon becoming so close to the monument that he could reach out a hand and touch it. By now, even Lionel was feeling impossibly great pressure. His bones creaked and his muscles tensed. However, compared to others, he was much more leisurely for one specific reason: he felt none of the mental pressure others did. With a leap, Lionel jumped toward the top of the monument. A green light lit the bottoms of his soles. 2 more jumps later, he landed atop the tall monument. Lionel's body shuddered when he touched the monument. His blood seemed to roll in reverse, but his strong body withstood it. He forcefully suppressed it and sat down in meditation under the astonished gazes of all those around him. It wasn't long before Lionel had completely forgotten everything in his surroundings, his mind becoming as calm as the surface of a lake. Who knew that the moment Lionel settled into a rhythm, a blinding pillar of red light would shoot up into the skies from the direction of the central tower? No matter how shocked everyone was by Lionel, this red pillar took up all of their attention. Someone was invading their eastern sector. The only person who didn't seem to react to this at all was Lionel, who continued to meditate. After all, he had already guessed that something like this would happen. A red pillar wouldn't appear for anyone at and below the royal rank. The only explanation was that kings and emperors had made their move. And they were obviously coming for him. Chapter 376. Lionel's mind was filled with visions of the winged swordsman. It was quite a beautiful sight to behold. Every motion was smooth and flowed into the next. The flap of his wings, the intake of a breath, the swing of his sword. His steps, his force, his thoughts. It was all in perfect union. The longer Lionel watched, the deeper he dove into the world. He could feel the familiar energies trying to assault his mind. But, compared to the past where he nearly died, it almost felt like something was tickling him. The capacity of his mind was simply too far beyond what it had been in the past. Eventually, Lionel felt that he had been far too cautious. Without hesitation, he began to reflect on the natural force art that called his dream world home. In that instant, he no longer felt like he was an observer. It was as though he had taken over the body of the winged swordsman. He even felt like he was a master swordsman, ruling over the world with a single blade. Lionel was very familiar with this feeling. Every time he began to comprehend a new spear, this was exactly the same feeling he would have. The artistic conception engraved itself into his mind. It's a much higher level of movement control compared to the primitive man. Lionel's heartbeat slowly descended, reaching a calm state once more. In fact, he felt as though the pressure the stone monument had on him was lessened by several degrees. The primitive man taught Lionel the value of body control. When he ran, the movement of his arms and torso were just as important as the movement of his legs. When he used his hands to attack, the placement of his feet and the torque of his hips was just as important as the placement of his arms. This was a comprehension Lionel had slowly built upon the more spear consciousnesses he absorbed. If he went back now, the deficiencies of the primitive man were too many, the most blatant of which was the fact this consciousness only focused on the body but not enough on force. However, regardless, Lionel was endlessly thankful for the foundation the primitive man gave him. Thanks to this foundation, Lionel felt that he could grasp the mysteries of this winged swordsman with much more ease. There's something I'm missing. This feeling is definitely very important to this world, but I know nothing about it. I'll have to ask the dictionary about it when I have time. Lionel opened his eyes and smiled, feeling very satisfied with his gains. He didn't expect to master the secrets of this stone monument so quickly, but this was definitely a good thing. It seemed he had underestimated the benefits his ability had bestowed upon him. This made Lionel even more eager to move on to the next monument. Much like the primitive man was a great foundation for this winged swordsman's stone monument, Lionel felt that the primitive woman's consciousness would be a great foundation for the Biyao woman's stone monument. Lionel still didn't know much about what Camelot called the general star even now. But, he felt if he comprehended the Bao woman's artistic conception, he would come to a truer understanding of just what it meant to be a general star. Lionel hopped down from the stone monument and walked toward Jirak, completely ignoring all the gazes around him. Jirak, you stay here. I'll be going to another stone monument. Jirak didn't know how to respond. Before he could say anything, Lionel had already vanished into the distance. Unfortunately for those who had come to learn more about the person who claimed the dream abode, they had run into a bit of a sticky situation. Just when they wanted to charge into the eastern sector, they found a white-robed young man in their way. The young man didn't say much. He simply stood there, his aura calm. Despite the fact there were several kings before him, he didn't say a single word. It was as though these kings really weren't worth much of anything to him. The kings froze when they saw such a scene. Anared, what do you mean by this? One of the kings narrowed his eyes. Clearly, he recognized this white-robes young man. In fact, if Lionel had been there, he too would recognize this young man as none other than Syl's elder brother. What do I mean? Anared's expression remained placid. You're invading my sector yet have the face to ask that? Stop twisting the facts, Anared. You know exactly why we're here. Oh. And I'm supposed to just allow you through to satisfy your own curiosity? And then what? There's only me here yet so many of you, I'm just supposed to take your word that you'll take a look and then leave? Do you take me for an ignorant fool? The expression of the kings flickered. Even if their main purpose here was to find out who owned the dream abode, there was no way that some of the more sinister among them hadn't thought of taking advantage of the situation. After so many of them flooded into the eastern sector, how could they possibly defend against them all? There were bound to be numerous benefits. At that same time, Anared's words spoke to something else. Before, Lionel had asked Anared if there really were so many emperors after seeing the state of the number of lit lampposts. Back then, Anared had simply answered that there was no restriction to the number of abodes a single emperor could claim. But, what Lionel hadn't realized back then was that, there was only ever Anared. There were no other emperors in the eastern sector but Lionel himself. Fine. They won't enter then. But what about us? At that moment, Anared's expressionless visage became a hint more serious. The emperor-level characters had made themselves known. Chapter 377. Rainred stepped forward, the crowd of kings splitting for him. He wore the same black robes accented with deep blue soft armor. He was a young man of charming looks and a somewhat dark gaze. And, unlike in the past, he wasn't followed by either Jilnia nor Wheelis of World's End Falls and Mirage Pavilion respectively. That said, he hadn't come alone either. He was followed by another pair of woman and man. Though, unlike Wheelis and Jilnia who couldn't have been more different from one another, this pair looked strikingly similar. At a glance, it was easy to make out that they were siblings, fraternal twins, in fact. This pair of twins walked side by side, their shoulders practically rubbing against one another. And, judging by their demeanor, they most definitely weren't subordinated to Rainred either. At the end of the first phase, there had been 7 emperors total. Lionel, Anared, Rainred, Jilnia, Wheelis and, these twins. The Moon siblings. For 2 emperor-level talents to appear in just one family, one could imagine the luck it would take. And most could only do exactly that, imagine. The Moon family, however, didn't have to do this. They birthed a brother-sister pair just 40 or so years ago that carried the hope of their future. Since this was a family, it was no surprise that they were a part of the city lord power structure and founded their strength upon governance and commerce. However, Anared and the rest of the Kiafur family had known for a long time that the Moon family had been leaning toward the powers for a long time already. Still, this situation likely had little to do with their affiliations. They were most likely just as curious as everyone else who this mysterious person who managed to claim the dream abode was. The truth was that even Anared only had a good idea of who it was. After all, as far as he was aware, there was only one other emperor. However, he had yet to confirm it, mostly because he too didn't dare to casually approach that abode. That said, that appearance of this person coincided with that young man's disappearance. Fine. If it's only you three, I can accept it. Anared replied calmly. However, if any others try to take advantage of the situation, don't blame me for being rude. The sword that floated to Anared's back vibrated wildly as though thirsting for blood. Beneath his might, several kings paled, unable to gather up the courage to battle. The sister moon sibling smiled. Her lips were such a bright shade of red that it seemed she had just been sipping blood from a wine glass. Lead the way. Her voice was so sweet it almost made one forget the tension in the atmosphere. Everyone here was intelligent. It was obvious that if Anared had a choice, he wouldn't allow any of them through no matter whether the number was small or not. As emperors, they had all participated in the Brave City trial before, so they knew what kind of advantages a successful invasion could give. Under normal circumstances, no one would ever give an enemy even an inkling of a chance at gaining an advantage. However, whether it was because he felt he couldn't face so many enemies or whether he wanted to conserve his strength, Anared didn't want to set off the sparks of war just yet, at least not until the third phase. Anared turned and started leading the three of them toward the Emperor abodes. But, before he could get very far, he heard another familiar giggle. Young heir Kiafur, you don't need to insult our intelligence like this, right? You're going in the wrong direction. The sister moon sibling spoke again, her voice light and airy. It somehow both made one comfortable and cold at the same time. Anared's step paused. Since you know where he is, point me in the right direction. His voice didn't give way to any embarrassment. He really didn't know where Lionel was. But, the three emperors who followed him shared a knowing glance. With the strength of these four emperors, it wasn't a surprise that they didn't take long to find Lionel. However, when Anared's gaze landed on him, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. At that moment, Lionel was the center of everyone's attention. He sat atop yet another stone monument, completely lost in his own world. Compared to other, his emperor brand seemed particularly dazzling, obscuring the black monitoring mark that was once the centerpiece of his face. Even when everyone was shocked by the sudden appearance of four more emperors, Lionel was unmoved. Or, rather, it was more accurate to say that he didn't spare any of his thoughts toward them. Though he knew four more individuals had appeared, he didn't stop his meditation. Rainred and the twins were stunned for a moment. Third dimension? The sister moon siblings' words were just as gentle on the ears as usual. However, this time, rather than just being calming and cold, it felt as though a bomb had erupted amidst the crowd. Do you know who he is? Rainred looked toward the Kiafur family heir. Anared sent a noncommittal glance over. He's the seated participant of my Kiafur family. He is courting my younger sister. The three emperors froze. However, it was then they remembered. There was an emperor that entered the eastern sector during the first phase. The commotion that young man caused was not small. In fact, the whole city quaked. Unfortunately, since then, no one had heard from the young man at all. And, this young man had also ignored the unspoken rules and had yet to visit the central tower. Over time, there had been so many things to deal with that this young man floated to the backs of their mind. Rainred frowned as he observed Lionel. This made things even more troublesome. The good news was that this emperor was still in the third dimension. This wasn't much to worry about. But, there were certain things during the trial that wouldn't strictly rely on strength. In addition, he wouldn't be easy to deal with regardless thanks to Anared's protection. Wait. Rainred's eyes narrowed. Isn't that a monitoring brand? Why does your seated participant have such a thing? It was difficult to spot beneath the Emperor brand. But, after noticing it, it was hard to unsee it. However, Anared's response was just as cool and collected. Is there a rule that said someone who's branded can't participate? You know as well as I do that this brand only means he is being monitored, not that he is a criminal. In addition, it will only be for a period of 3 years. That isn't what I meant. Rainred responded. Why would someone of your family be under suspicion? And, why is it that I didn't know that your family had recruited such a genius? Is there a need for you to know everything about my family? Anared gaze sharpened in warning. Alright. The sister moon sibling got between the two. We only came here to form relationships, not break them. Can't we just have a conversation with him? What do you say, young man, will you come down? The final part of her words were aimed at Lionel. On terrain, no matter what man heard a request from such a beautiful lady, they would likely do their best to please. However, despite the words traveling to Lionel's ears, he didn't react. How rude was it to ask someone in the middle of meditation to come down and talk for your own convenience? Had Lionel not been able to split his mind, the act of the moon sister sending her voice toward him like this could have caused him to suffer backlash. An awkward silence fell over the stone monument region as Lionel continued to meditate. At that moment, the ever-silent brother moon sibling suddenly opened his eyes, a murderous glint lighting them. Chapter 378. Even among those of terrain, the moon siblings stood out. They had flowing silver hair, overly pale skin, and a pair of red lips that seemed to drip of blood. If Lionel cared to observe them during the critical juncture of his comprehension, he would definitely assume them to be the vampires of legend and give himself a good chuckle. That said, seemingly going with this theme, when the brother moon sibling opened his eyes, the murderous aura seemed to be perfectly in line with this. It seemed that even compared to Anared, he was that much more protective of his own sister. Just when he was about to make a moon, his sister pinched the sleeves of his silver robes. The brother moon sibling looked toward her, wondering why it was he was stopped. There was nothing he hated more than this. Had it not been for the fact they were family, maybe this would have been enough for him to lash out. However, his sister didn't explain. She simply looked toward Lionel, the smile on her face not fading in the least. Brother can't even approach the stone monument so closely. It's not a matter of not being physically capable, but rather a limitation of our minds. If brother really attacked now, he would be at a great disadvantage almost immediately. It seems that this man was already aware of this. This made everything more complicated. Despite being out in the open, Lionel was probably in the safest place he could be with the exception of his own abode. At that moment, a group came rushing in, seemingly finding out about all the commotion. Big brother. Syl's voice rang out from amidst them. But, before she could say more, she was stunned silent by the sight of Lionel and 3 other emperors. The other seated participants of the Kiafur family rushed in after her. Though they were here to participate, another one of their tasks was to protect the young family miss whenever they could. They had had their hands full over the last few days trying to keep Syl away from the dream abode. But this time, they couldn't stop her at all. Anared swept a glance over them that made them shudder. They knew he was reprimanding them for failing their task to keep her away. Come here, Syl, Anared said somewhat coldly. He felt safer when his sister was right by his side. At that moment, the situation suddenly changed. Everyone's gaze unexpectedly shot away from Lionel and toward the eastern sector gates. Someone was crossing the second phase trial. Though it was true that Lionel's actions were a far greater rarity, someone passing the second phase was definitely a major event as well. They all watched as the gates trembled. They could sense the perseverance of the person on the other side. One could imagine the hardship one needed to face to cross the bloody aura of the second phase. It took several moments, but eventually, the smallest soldier doors shook open, cracking open just a fraction. A figure squeezed through, his appearance disheveled and bloody. But, that was when something heart-wrenching occurred. Just when the figure was almost all the way through, the doors slammed shut, catching the ankle of their right foot. An agonizing scream shook the eastern sector as the person collapsed onto the dirt roads of Brave City. Blood pooled at their legs, dyeing the ground a harsh crimson as the figure convulsed. The amount of perseverance it took to cross the barrier of aura was astronomical. It was no surprise that this person had no energy left. To deal with such an injury at such a time, everyone was stunned. But they couldn't have expected for the silent, unmoving Lionel to suddenly awaken at that moment. Seeing the situation, Lionel stood, his body shooting forward. In that moment, if one wasn't looking closely, it would feel as though a bird had just soared over their heads. The pupils of the four emperors all constricted at once. The Baowoman's stone monument was quite close to the gates. And, due to the fact that all the abodes in this region were just various sized tents, there was nothing obstructing their view right to them. In what felt like an instant, Lionel appeared beside this person. Xyler. Lionel mumbled. At that moment, the familiar face shook on the ground. He seemed to have gone into shock. As a warrior of the fourth dimension, such an injury should have been painful, but definitely not to the point of putting him into such a state. The only explanation was that Xyler had given his everything to reach this point. He didn't have any more energy left to give. Lionel's body suddenly burst with a blinding golden light. Light elemental force surged toward him from all sides. For a moment, his flowing bronze-gold hair made him look as though he was a deity. Even compared to the past, calling upon the light element was far easier for Lionel. In fact, he felt the difference was easily tens of times. Part of this was because of the strengthening of his mind, but maybe the most important part was his innate force node. Grand Heel. A surging wind shook the surroundings. If one looked closely, it was possible to see that in addition to the main force art, countless smaller ones hovered around Lionel, feeding into the main force art as though playing an important supporting role. Under the stunned gazes of everyone, Xyler's shivering slowly came to a stop. And then, his severed leg began to slowly reform itself. Though it failed to regrow in a single attempt, Lionel cast Grand Heel again before coming to a stop. He knew he could continue, but this was enough to stabilize Xyler's situation for now. If he really did continue, he would drain his stamina and then he wouldn't be able to guarantee his own safety, let alone Xyler's. Lionel felt somewhat guilty for his current situation, so, of course he would do his best to help. Lionel propped the unconscious Xyler up, piggybacking him. Though the little mink was a bit unsatisfied with its sleeping arrangements being disrupted, it clambered up to the top of Lionel's head and made another bed for itself. With that, Lionel began to walk back, his hands clasped under Xyler's thighs. However, it was a given that those emperors wouldn't just allow him to walk back to his abode. How could they give up this opportunity? Getting over her shock, the Sister Moon sibling stepped forward. So, are you free to speak now? Chapter 379. Lionel's steps paused. He really didn't know what these people wanted to talk about. It seemed more to him that they wanted to find an excuse to do something to him. However, Lionel didn't care about any of this. He gave the Sister Moon sibling a dazzling smile. It was so genuine and light that it made her heart stop for a brief moment. My name is Lionel Morales. I am a citizen of Earth. This brand on my forehead is an unfortunate circumstance. I just got unlucky in coming here during a period of time they were monitoring for fugitives. I'm sure as citizens of Terrain, you know more about this than I do. Lionel thought to himself for another few moments. I believe that is all. Make sure to spread that far and wide. Lionel didn't speak particularly loudly, but his voice resonated, reaching the ears of all those within the square. The atmosphere seemed to freeze. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Did he say something wrong? It can't be that racism is a thing in these places. No, that shouldn't be it. Lionel saw plenty of people from other worlds coming to Terrain. If they weren't alright with such a thing, why would they make it such a big staple of their culture? The four emperors were shaken once again. Lionel was filled with too many surprises. Claiming the dream abode was already enough to shake them to the core. Having a light elemental affinity so high on top of that was enough to make them green with envy despite how well they tried to hide it. But, even compared to all of this, the name Earth seemed to shake them all the more. Feelings of jealousy, animosity, and disdain swirled in the air. This wasn't a matter of nationality or racism, as odd as it seemed to say this after describing such vitriol. Earth and terrain seemed to be on two opposing sides of the spectrum. While the common citizens had never heard of Earth, the elites of terrain all had. Terrain was reaching the end of its growth potential. Earth had an endlessly paved road before it. Terrain didn't receive the support of higher-level worlds. Earth received the support of countless. Terrain was entering a crossroads that might end their world as they once knew it, and Earth was just beginning to bud. The more one compared, the more striking the differences became. Did you just say Earth? Rainred's gaze narrowed. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Yes? Rainred's gaze narrowed even further before looking toward Anared. Is this how your Kiafur family operates now? Allowing those of other worlds to partake in our resources? A slight hint of animosity hung in the air. Regardless of what side you were on, the idea of someone stealing away something that was rightfully yours wouldn't sit well with you. It only made it worse that Lionel was in the third dimension. Those who wanted to partake in the Brave City trials but weren't part of the major powers of terrain had to wait to the second phase. But, who would believe that someone in the third dimension could do this? The contrast Xyler provided was too drastic. Everyone could tell that Xyler was strong enough to become a royal at worst. Yet, he was branded as a soldier now and had no choice but to abide by the rules of a soldier. If Lionel had gone through the second phase like he was supposed to, it would have been impossible for him to become an emperor and all the more impossible for him to claim the dream abode and put them in such a passive position. Anared's gaze remained indifferent. The matters of the Kiafur family are ours to deal with alone. Since when was it the turn of the Cliff's Edge Terrace to speak on our matters? And, I'm also certain that if one were to pick out a traitor to our world, it most definitely wouldn't be me. Rainred's glare froze. Clearly, he hadn't expected such pointed words from Anared. All the while, Lionel was lost in his own thoughts. If I go back and pass the trial of the second phase, my name would spread far and wide, right? Aina might hear about it. Lionel thought for a moment. With his intelligence, he could immediately see the animosity aimed toward him. And, when he noticed the glances toward Xyler on his back, he managed to put it all together himself. Just when Lionel planned on acting on this though, he paused and grinned. Hate moves more than anything else. Last I remembered, you're an emperor too, correct? Lionel looked toward Rainred with a childishly innocent gaze. If you want my abode, go claim it. Suddenly, Lionel's warm smiling face became extremely punchable. In fact, I think I'm in the mood to claim more abodes. I'll be taking over the Star, Light and Darkness abode. After I do, you can feel free to challenge any one of them. Lionel pondered on something for a moment. Now that I think about it, don't you also get some benefits for challenging an abode in enemy territory? You should want to, too. Right? Lionel's smile never faded despite sensing the animosity in the air. Anared's brows furrowed, not quite understanding what Lionel was trying to do. Was he really just so arrogant? You don't believe me? Lionel blinked innocently. The crowd was riled up. They wanted to see nothing more than Lionel falling flat on his face. But, at the same time, they wanted to beat him up where he stood. The conflicting feelings left them feeling so stifled that several almost coughed up blood. Just as Lionel was about to boldly lead everyone to the elite abodes, the city shook once again. Everyone's gaze shot toward the northern gates as they blasted open, causing the whole city to quake. As though this was a catalyst, the central tower flickered. A mass of energy converged toward the peak of the tower. At first, the form they took was blurry, but it soon became a row of numbers that read, 9:23:59:59. A countdown to the third phase had begun. In that moment, the suffocating aura around Brave City began to slowly weaken and anxious soon-to-be spectators excitedly stood. It seemed that the true trials would be starting soon. Chapter 380. Lionel placed Xyler down on a bed within his dream abode. His gaze flashed with a cold light. If it hadn't been for Syl's elder brother, he probably would have had to find his way out of that encirclement. If it was because of his own words, Lionel wouldn't mind. Plus, since he dared to step out of this abode, he also had adequate preparations at the ready. However, Lionel knew that it wasn't so simple. All along the way, the Sister Moon's sibling was steering the crowd with her words. She was quite a dangerous woman indeed. In the end, it was due to the commotion at the northern gate and Lionel's own sharpness that Rain Red and the twins could only leave without accomplishing much of anything. It seemed that the start of the third phase was unlike the first two. Whoever it was who opened the northern gates was definitely a future calamity they needed to prepare for. As difficult as it was to become an emperor during the first phase, it was tens of times more difficult to do so during the second phase. In addition, this person was a true fourth-dimensional entity unlike Lionel who had only broken through in one aspect. So, compared to the danger Lionel posed, this person was a much greater threat. There's not much time left. I hear the third phase has spectators, hopefully Aina is among them. Lionel's coldness vanished into a genuine smile. During Lionel's life, Aina had only come to watch him play football once. The fact she went at all was definitely a big change for her. Usually, she avoided events like that like the plague. Just the simple action alone warmed Lionel's heart. Truthfully, back then, all the events that happened left him so shell-shocked that he forgot that simple fact. That was right, she had come to watch him. Lionel's smile became a grin. To anyone observing from afar, he looked like a love-struck fool. Hey little guy. Lionel scooped the little mink off the top of his head, stroking the little one's soft fur. I know you've wanted to go to that abode for a long time. Go ahead and break through. Little Blackstar sat up excitedly and suddenly vanished from Lionel's arms. Lionel chuckled. If that little guy really managed to break through, who knew how much trouble he'd get into? When Lionel met Little Blackstar, the little mink was an elite S-grade threat. They had done a lot of growing together since then. Though Lionel wasn't exactly sure how the cultivation of beasts worked, he trusted the little guy could make his own way forward. This was the advantage the universe gave to beasts, anyway. Lionel took a deep breath and casted a few more, Grand Heal, S on Xyler. Regrowing a limb was definitely much more difficult than he had thought it would be, and that was even with his vastly improved, Grand Heal. Of course, part of the reason was because Xyler was in the fourth dimension. But, luckily, it was just a foot and not his entire leg that had been taken out. Leo. Let me in. At that moment, Lionel suddenly heard a distant voice. He cast a glance out of the window to find Jirak yelling at him from hundreds of meters away. It was clear the bald young man was still too scared to approach the dream abode of his own accord. Lionel allowed Xyler to continue resting before letting Jirak in. He too had some questions to ask the Black family heir. Did you hear? An emperor of the second phase appeared. That hasn't happened before. Jirak boisterously strolled in, his face filled with awe. The third phase is probably going to be wild. I didn't participate last time, but I'm definitely going to make a name for myself this time around. Jirak. Lionel cut the young heir off before he could continue his spiel. Seemingly sensing Lionel's seriousness, Jirak frowned and turned back. What is it? Lionel looked toward Jirak deeply, causing the latter to feel no small amount of discomfort. What do you think of Earth? Lionel suddenly spoke. Ah. Jirak froze, clearly not expecting this line of questioning. His eyes darted around as though trying to find a crutch to lean on, maybe a joke to ease the mood, but all he found was bland, neatly ordered black and white furniture. Lionel's eyes narrowed. It seemed he was right. There was definitely more to this. Tell me. Lionel pressed. Lionel frowned. After a while he shook his head. If you don't want to answer, that's fine. Lionel turned and walked away. But, he never made a move to close the door to the abode he had just let Jirak through. His meaning was quite clear. Someone who signed their life away should act as such. If Jirak was unwilling to act as he should, then that only mean he didn't take this matter as seriously as Lionel once thought. And, since he didn't, that meant his character wasn't as Lionel previously deduced either. Lionel could tell that whatever Jirak knew was quite important. In fact, it should be to the point that he valued this information even more than his own life. That was fine. Lionel never planned to kill him in the first place, but he had already had one person who placed certain things above their friendship with him before. And, in such a dangerous place, within an unknown world, Lionel didn't feel like putting his life in the hands of another such person again. Jirak stood stunned, not quite knowing what to do. He, quite frankly, felt like a bride that had been abandoned at the altar. Such a joke would be enough to make him laugh at any other time, but he didn't find it funny in the least right now. As Jirak was hesitating, he suddenly felt his mind growing hazy. He immediately realized that this was the dream force beginning to encroach on his consciousness. Whatever protections Lionel had left for him were beginning to vanish. In a slight panic, Jirak quickly left through the door, a slight discomfort in his chest. This time, he had 2 reasons he didn't dare to look back toward that abode. Chapter 381. Lionel didn't spare any more thoughts toward Jirak. He didn't feel that it was a shame, nor did he feel any sense of self-pity. He was already focusing on another task already. This was just the kind of person Lionel was. At most, Lionel was now certain that there was something important about his home world he needed to find out on this planet. Though he didn't know exactly what it was, he would be able to find out. But, first, Lionel locked himself into the same top-floor room of his abode. He split one portion of his mind to monitor Zyler's situation and another to make sure that the little mink was all right, then he prepared to enter the lab setting. Just as he was doing so, his lip curled as he sensed a fiery pillar of darkness shoot into the skies as the little mink claimed an abode of his own. Of course, this was done through the little guy's connection with Lionel. So, technically, it was Lionel claiming another. But, it brought a smile to Lionel's face regardless before he once again became serious. He didn't care about what commotion this would cause, he had something much more important in mind. Now that he had broken into the 4th dimension with his spirit pressure, he could search Ailiard's mind without worrying about the consequences. Lionel entered the lab setting and brought out the snow globe that held Ailiard. With a thought, the mental mage appeared, still shackled by illusory chains. Ailiard coughed violently, his gaze showing hints of confusion as he looked around. When he looked up and saw Lionel standing above him, a hint of rage and trepidation could be seen in his eyes. Over this period of time, Lionel had been allowing the suspended animation ability of the segmented cube to slowly heal Ailiard. So, compared to the manic state the mental mage had been in before, he was much better now. Of course, Lionel had no idea how rare treasures that could heal mental injuries were. If he did, he would know that he had taken the segmented cube for granted once more. That said, Lionel hadn't done this for Ailiard's sake but rather his own. The more whole Ailiard's memories were, the easier things would be on him. If he was picking through memory fragments, it would be a pain and maybe even difficult to piece together the true story. Lionel didn't spare any words for Ailiard. He found it to be a waste of his time. So, without hesitation, he activated Mind Search. Ailiard's eyes widened before a sinister light shone in his eyes. He thought that Lionel was foolish trying to use such a technique on a mental mage like him. He almost salivated at the thought of turning Lionel into a mindless slave. But, when he felt the strength of Lionel's spirit pressure, he paled. How was this the strength of someone in the 3rd dimension? It was impossible. It was then he thought of a shocking possibility. It can't be. You can't have. Ailiard knew things that the others of Camelot had not. After all, he wasn't a part of the original legend, he had been sent in by his organization to infiltrate and capture the core treasure. But, it was precisely because of this that he was shocked. Everyone knew that it was impossible to break into the 4th dimension with the mind unless the body was strong enough. Doing so without a solid foundation would lead to one imploding in on themselves. Yet, Lionel's body was definitely still within the third dimension. In addition, the force that circulated his body was also considered to be within the third. It shouldn't have been possible to do this unless Lionel had an ability or a lineage factor that allowed him to circumvent these rules. Unfortunately for Ailiard, Lionel had not just one of these things, but both. Ailiard fell into despair as he felt his memories being eaten away at. No matter how hard he fought back, Lionel's mind was like a violent swarm. Mind search was a truly sinister technique. A more accurate title would most definitely be mind swallow. To say that one was searching was completely inaccurate. The truth of what Lionel was doing was ingesting all the memories that were useful to him and discarding all those that weren't. Due to the style of the technique, Lionel had to build a bridge between his mind and Ailiard's. This meant that when he found a memory to be useless, rather than it remaining with Ailiard, it dissipated along the bridge, leaving Ailiard with nothing. If the two of their minds had been of similar strength, this bridge would cause a tug of war to erupt. However, Lionel's mind was so much stronger than Ailiard's that it was nothing but child's play. Ailiard's helplessness soon became dullness, then was replaced by a complete vacancy as he fell over, drool leaking from the side of his mouth. Lionel didn't spare the brain-dead man a single glance. He closed his eyes, organizing and sifting through everything he had just learned. The first thing he realized was that Ailiard didn't know much. However, this much was to be expected. He should have been fairly low on the totem pole. Still, for an organization that just expected Lionel to hand over all evidence of their crimes, they didn't take many precautions either. Finally, Lionel learned of the name of the organization he was dealing with. The name that so many avoided speaking of. Shield Cross Stars. It was only now Lionel understood how unlucky he was. This so-called Shield Cross Stars organization was actually a police force of the universe. Its duty was to protect the safety and humanitarian rights of beasts and humanoids across the worlds. The main issue here was that Lionel had never expected that the same organization he had slighted by not handing in evidence of their wrongdoing was the very same organization that happened to brand him as a fugitive worth monitoring. Was it just a coincidence? Or had they targeted him on purpose? From Lionel's analysis, he was fairly certain that it truly was a coincidence. But, if he was correct, just how unlucky was he? Now, an organization that had it out for him also knew his location at all times? Fuck. Lionel stood, his jaw becoming steely. He wasn't safe here. He had to find a way back to Earth as quickly as possible. Since there wasn't a branch of SCS there just yet, it would be more difficult for them to cause problems for him. The issue was, how? Entering another zone would be difficult. Using teleportation platforms was probably another no-go. They'll find Aina first then think of what to do. Lionel sighed. He felt as though a guillotine was hanging over his head. However, at least he was aware of its existence now. Not only this, but he had become aware of many other things. The days quickly flew by. Soon, Lionel would have no choice but to join everyone else within the central tower. That morning, with just a few hours left until the timer would hit 0, a shadowy figure slowly stalked toward the central tower. A prominent hunched back was the first thing anyone caught sight of. As for the rest, it was shrouded in black. By now, everyone knew that this was the sword monstress, the very woman who caused the commotion at the northern gate. Chapter 382. The sword mantra's steps were light. It was almost impossible to accept that her figure was so large yet so nimble. From the third phase onward, all of the trials would begin with the central tower as the centerpiece. As a result, the population of people flowing into it was quite large to begin with. So, it was no surprise that such an odd figure stood out right from the very beginning. Of course, there was no lack of odd individuals. However, from the very beginning, most eyes had been focused toward the northern sector's entry gates. For such a figure to come from this specific region immediately caught the attention of many. Despite the fact those tasked with observing the northern sector had their own speculations, they didn't dare to confirm it themselves. If they were correct, this person was the only emperor to be birthed from the second phase since Brave City appeared on terrain. This wasn't a person they could afford to offend. Though they couldn't see what was beneath the hood, this only made this person more fear-inducing. They didn't want to get mixed up in anything far beyond themselves and lose their lives for a ridiculous reason. Like this, several backed off after the sword monstress appeared, rushing off to their superiors with their conjectures. The sword monstress continued to walk forward as though nothing had changed. The central tower was one of many floors and was the only structure in Brave City that could rival the walls in height. At the same time, it was also an incredibly wide structure despite the fact it was definitely much taller than it was so. This design left one feeling as though one had stepped into an all-new world after entering just the first floor. The first floor of the tower was expansive and incredibly bland. It acted as nothing more than a conduit to help the flow of people reach the places they wanted to go. There were no stairs nor any elevators like one would see on Earth. Rather, there were elevated paths with queues of people. Each had a miniature teleportation station that would take one to a given floor. During the first and second phase, the tower was nothing more than a restaurant. With enough status, one could reach the top floor and gain access to delicacies the likes of which the world of terrain rarely saw. It was unfortunate that Lionel wasn't aware of this, or he may very well have taken advantage. He had long since become tired of his usual bland diet of meat and more meat. Of course, this was also mostly due to his own laziness. He had obtained many delicious fruits and vegetables from the underground garden he found within the hive. But he kept them all within the snow globes rather than properly fostering them. After all, he was a force crafter, not a gardener. At this moment, though, not a single person was traveling to higher floors. Even if one wanted to, the teleportation pads were out of commission. Those who were aware of the changes that happened as the third phase approached weren't surprised. This was simply the tower preparing itself for its true purpose. Hey, are you the emperor from the northern sector? Let me see the brand on your forehead. The once bustling tower suddenly fell into silence. The voice that had called out was booming. It had enough forcefulness to it to directly suppress the voices of everyone else. Of course, this was because no one else was trying to speak over the crowd at the same time, or else this matter wouldn't have been so easy. Everyone's attention oscillated between the emperor who had spoken and the black figure that had been targeted. There were very few emperors in Brave City to begin with. So, everyone immediately recognized the original speaker as Wheeless Mirage, the young heir to the Mirage Pavilion. He had a rotund body, yet his charms were also somewhat feminine. Of course, the red robes accented with violet soft armor didn't help him escape this image very well. It couldn't be helped. The heir to the Mirage Pavilion was rarely a man. In fact, this was only the second time in their history that such a thing had happened. This said, no one looked down on this chubby, feminine man. So, when the black figure didn't bother to respond, the tension in the air grew palpable. Wheeless' gaze narrowed. His cheeks squeezed, almost covering his eyes completely. Wheeless suddenly chuckled, his body moving forward slowly. Rainred and Jilnia, who had been by his side, didn't say anything as they watched him. The third phase had yet to begin, so they were still under the rules of the second phase. There was no rules against battle outside of trials just yet. In addition, even if there were, they would still support Wheeless' actions at this moment. The best way to learn about such a mysterious figure would be to test them personally. As heirs to powers, they didn't believe that some unknown could be better than them. In their minds, if they were born from lesser families and didn't receive quotas, they too could become emperors through the second phase. Whether that was actually true or not was still up for debate. But, all that mattered was that they believed it. The shadowy figure didn't move in the slightest. Her hulking figure seemed unperturbed by Wheeless' looming threat, even as the young heir's footsteps echoed through the floor. In a corner, Syl and Anared watched on in silence. They didn't have any particular horse in this race, so they too were just spectating just like everyone else. "Big brother, do you recognize that person?" Anared's gaze narrowed slightly, but in the end he shook his head. No. I don't. Syl's lovely eyes blinked with an innocent curiosity. It seemed that the legend of the sword monstress hadn't spread very wide just yet. But this made quite some sense. After all, one of the reasons the sword monstress was able to make it here was because the influx of people migrating toward Brave City made it difficult to pick out individuals. At that moment, Willis made it to within 3 meters of the shadowy figure before stopping. If before everyone was already avoiding this person, they were now giving the figure an even wider berth. No one had any interest in getting caught up in this drama. Chapter 383. Willis opened his mouth to speak once more, but, bang! A heavy sword swung from the sword monstress back, landing on the stone's grounds of the tower's floors. Despite the heft of the sword, not a single mark was left behind. But no one doubted the strength of the sword monstress due to this. The broad sword vibrated wildly upon impact as though looking to launch itself out from the hands of the sword monstress as she faced Willis. When the sword appeared, Jilnea's gaze narrowed. Willis stood just under 3 meters before the sword monstress. But, due to the outrageous length of the massive sword, it clanged before him, just a mere foot or two away. In fact, it seemed to be aimed between his legs, leaving him feeling a slight chill. However, what Willis felt wasn't fear. The process had been slow enough for him to witness the start to the end without issue. To a warrior on his level, it hadn't been a problem to see it all. The issue was that, his heart still felt a slight trepidation. It was a warning. Willis, though, had every intention of lashing out. Not only was it important for them to know the limits of this figure, but it was also a matter of his face. Where would he put it if he were to back off now? Especially since he was the one who started all of this. It seems that. Just when Willis wanted to say more, he suddenly sensed a figure appear by his side. The contrast between this figure and the hulking, black-robed figure before them was too striking. Jilnea was a goddess in the eyes of many. She had a small, soft waist, flowing black hair, and a flawless complexion that seemed sculpted by the hands of a master. Though she was lacking in comparison to Era, this seemed to be due to lack of a mature and refined temperament rather than a shortcoming of her own looks. All of this alone would have been enough to capture many hearts. But, the way her white robes hung to her curves captured the soul. And, whether by design or coincidence, the way her sky-blue soft armor cupped her chest and accentuated her slender legs only made more imaginations run wild. The moment she appeared, most directly forgot about Willis and what he had been planning to do. To them, there was no better entertainment than a beauty, even if she only stood there and did nothing else. In a corner to his own, having reunited with the members of his Black City, Jirak was enthralled. He only barely managed to stop himself from whistling. It was fine if he teased a weak woman, but if he teased someone like Jilnea, well, let's just say he didn't have any fantasies of being castrated anytime soon. What are you doing? Jilnea all but ignored Willis. But, it was difficult to get angry at a beauty, so Willis only shook his head and let her do as she pleased. That sword. Jilnea said coldly, looking from the tip of the blade that reverberated against the ground to the shadowy figure. I received reports from my subordinate cities that several massacres had occurred. The perpetrator was a woman with a hunched back, dressed in black robes, and wielding a great sword. That was you? A shocked silence overcame everyone. The first thing that caught them by surprise was the word woman. It was hard to connect the hulking figure before them with the fairer sex. But, after that sunk in, they recognized the word massacre. You mean to tell them that someone actually slaughtered their way through World's End Falls territory? And even dared to come to Brave City right afterward? They couldn't decide whether this person was brave or just stupid. At this point, it didn't even matter whether Jilnea's words were true or not. When it came to matters like this, whoever held the most strength would be the one in the right. And it seemed now that not only had this sword monstress angered Willis with her disregard, but she had also enraged Jilnia by slighting the power behind her. No matter how others looked at it, this would end incredibly badly for this cloaked figure. Still, despite the young heiress' pointed questions, the sword monstress still didn't respond. The reverberations of her sword sung through the tower's first floor as though acting as her reply. "If you're dissatisfied, just come," it seemed to say. At that very moment, Lionel stood before the dark abode, shaking his head. He turned his head toward the looming numbers in the distance and sighed again. 0:0:8:39. Considering his location, it wouldn't take him long to get to the central tower. But, he still felt uncomfortable cutting it so close. He wasn't sure if there would be a penalty for being late. But, considering his current situation, he didn't dare to test it out. He felt that if there was a timer, there was a reason for it being there. Now, whether that was true or not, once again, he was unsure. But, better safe than sorry. He was a bit regretful that he had allowed the little mink to enter on his own now. Unfortunately, Lionel had forgotten that the first time he watched the little mink evolve, the little guy had fallen into a deep sleep for several days. This was likely happening again. Forget it. It will take me 2 minutes and 21 seconds to make it from here to the tower at full speed. I'll wait until 0:0:2:30 is left on the clock, then. Lionel felt that the little mink should be fine within the abode. From what he knew, there was no one else capable of claiming a dark abode. And, even if there were, they would all be taking part in the third phase. So, everything should be fine. Just when Lionel had made this decision, a black blur suddenly shot out from the house and barreled right into his chest. The streak was so quick that due to Lionel's absent-mindedness, he didn't even notice what happened until it was too late. Oof. Lionel coughed, feeling his ribs rebound against his heart and lungs. After a while, he laughed, looking at the bundle of fur in his arms. "Were you trying to kill me or something?" Lionel chuckled. "Yip. Yip." Lionel's lip twitched. "Why does that sound like a yes?" The little mink ignored Lionel's words and crawled to his favorite spot around his neck. "Fine, fine. You win. Alright, let's go." Chapter 384. Jilnia's eyes narrowed. "You overestimate yourself." What happened next was so sudden that no one could have expected it. It was hard to imagine that beauty who elicited the feeling of care and protection in them all would suddenly surge forward and attack without warning. In one instant, Jilnia was like a delicate flower in a vase. In the next, she was a pouncing panther, her slender legs exploding with undeniable power and strength. The sword monstress responded as quickly as it seemed humanly possible, raising her sword like a shield across her body. Jilnia's palm shot forward like a venomous serpent, slamming against the spine of the great sword. Bang! The sword monstress body convulsed. It was just a single palm, but it felt as though she had been hit 3 times continuously. A surge of concentric wind ricocheted off the side of her sword, sending her sliding across the ground. Jilnia didn't seem intent on stopping, her beautiful eyes remaining indifferent as she shot forward again. Her movements gave one the illusion of rushing water. It had an undeniable forcefulness, but also hid a fluidity and flexibility that accentuated the curves of a woman. Bang! A second palm descended. This one was several times stronger than the previous. Rather than carrying 3 layered strikes, this one carried 4. This time, the sword monstress lost her footing. Unable to slide along the ground anymore, she stumbled backward and got tossed off her feet. Jilnia's attack was relentless. Any veteran of battle knew that whoever gained an initiative would hold an upper hand. If one managed to keep this advantage, victory would only be a matter of time. However, it soon became very clear that Jilnia didn't need the initiative to claim victory. Whether it was speed, strength, or ability, she surpassed this cloaked figure by not just a single level. This left those watching baffled. They had thought that this cloaked figure would have a high level of skill after daring to offend 2 heirs. Yet, it seemed that when comparing whether this woman was brave or foolish, it was most likely the latter. Willis felt his anger dissipate. What a waste of emotions. He couldn't believe he wasted time getting angry at a person so far beneath him. It seems that Jilnia gained an inkling of comprehension toward her false style. Couple that with her ability and she truly would be too troublesome to deal with. Every time Jilnia attacked, it was as though 3, 4, 5, and sometimes even 6 of her were assaulting the same person all at the same time. Her heart couldn't help but be filled with disdain. Just die. She thought coldly. She didn't know who this person was, but she had truly never met anyone more foolish. Thanks to the times, this sword monstress had already been lucky enough to escape the clutches of her power. Yet, instead of accepting this bout of good fortune, she actually dove right back into the lion's den. Jilnia's palm shot toward the sword monstress' head. The air around her palm trembled. If one looked closely, it seemed as though her strike was being superimposed. A portion reflected where her palm would be, a portion reflected where it was now, and the last reflected where it had been. These attacks came together as one, causing the air to quake. Had this strike been sent out in a third-dimensional world, there was no doubt that the clap of the sound barrier shattering would have sounded. It was at that moment when Jilnia's palm was just moments away from collapsing the sword monstress head in on itself that things suddenly changed. The sword monstress aura surged. A sinister, dark and bloodthirsty air erupted. From beneath the hooded cloak, one could see 2 eyes blazing with a blinding gold light that flickered with a deep darkness. The sword monstress swung her great sword to meet Jilnia's palm. Bang! The sword monstress took several steps back before stabilizing herself while Jilnia took just one. But, without hesitation, the sword monstress shot forward again, her great sword trailing to her back like the tail of a comet. She brought her sword forward in a great arc, leaving a blur in the air. Bang! Jilnia forced the sword monstress back again, her expression filled with rage. It was as though she couldn't believe that this beast of a woman would dare fight back against her. The spectators remained silent as though scared to get involved in such a thing. They too hadn't expected the sword monstress to suddenly fight back, but the truth was that it didn't seem to matter. However, those who were clever among them seemed to realize that maybe the sword monstress wasn't as foolish as she seemed. By now, there was already less than 5 minutes before the timer struck 0. By feigning an inability to fight back at all in the beginning, she managed to drag out the battle. It was only after it seemed she really might die that she really started to fight. If things went on like this, there was no way Jilnia would be able to kill her before the timer rang out. And, when the third phase began, all the rules would change. Most intelligent people seemed to realize this. But, it was difficult to calmly analyze things in the heat of battle, especially when you were enraged like Jilnia. As for why Willis and Rainred hadn't explained this to Jilnia, there were 2 reasons. For one, if someone had to explain this to her, Jilnia would only lose more face. And, secondly, after seeing the sword monstress combat power, they no longer feared her. They didn't care whether she died or not, it would hardly change anything. This was the same reason they had for not pressing forward to kill Lionel. His impact on the coming trials would be limited. Bang! The sword monstress slid back once again. But, this time, Jilnia didn't pursue. So that's your plot? The beautiful heiress looked toward the ticking time, visible anger twisting her delicate features. Unfortunately for you, you've still underestimated me. At that moment, many touched their ears, not believing what they were hearing. Where was this sound of rushing water coming from? Chapter 385. Jilnia brandished her palms in a composed stance, her gaze cold. Just like there were weapons forces, there were likewise forces for various bodily martial arts. Fist force, palm force, various kicking and leg forces, they all existed. However, just like weapon forces, these bodily martial art forces didn't have anything particularly special to them other than a slight boost in strength. When Lionel comprehended his spear force, it was a product of the spear consciousnesses he observed within spear domain. He was able to constantly build on this spear force, refining it and perfecting it. Despite the fact Lionel's spear force was still just an empty shell right now, it was still far more powerful than it had been in the past. In the same way, bodily forces had to be refined over time. Only in this way could they manifest true strength. The so-called false style was a martial arts discipline of the world's end false power. It emphasized a steady, unrelenting flow. Every attack flowed into the next. Upon gaining an initiative with this style, it was impossible to lose it. Had it not been for Jianghu choosing to take a step back now, the sword monstress would still be on her back foot. If Lionel had been here, he would realize that this so-called style was exactly the discipline he had been learning through the stone monuments. For the false style, only upon reaching a high level of comprehension would one hear the sound of rushing waters. It was clear that not only had Jianghu begun to grasp her power's core teachings, but she was well on her way to mastering them. Jianghu knew well just how suited this style was to her. Her ability was shockingly an exceptionally rare time affinity ability that allowed her to layer her attacks. It made a single attack feel like many, giving her great offensive prowess. Unfortunately, among time affinity abilities, hers was ranked so near the bottom that she couldn't even dream of claiming the time abode. The first time she came to Brave City, she foolishly overestimated herself and almost lost her life in the attempt. In fact, she was still suffering from the loss of over 10 years from her lifespan. However, this didn't mean that her ability was weak. In fact, when coupled with the false style, she was likely the strongest amongst herself, Rain Red and Wheeless. Knowing this, when she saw the enemy of her power before her, a fiery anger bubbled up within her heart. She was the strongest. How could she possibly allow such a plan to succeed? Die. Jianghu shot forward again. But, this time, her speed seemed to have almost doubled, her palms raining down like the judgment of a god from above. Bang! 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 The sword monstress was hardly able to block, but her success only pissed Jianghu off more. Jianghu's gaze flashed with a hint of red. By now, the sound of rushing water reached a peak. It was as though they were all standing at the base of an impossibly vast waterfall, falling with such strength that it shattered the rocks at its base into powder. Jianghu's next strike was so fast that it bypassed the defense of the sword monstress' great sword and shot right toward her head. The glow of two eyes flickered beneath the hood. With an inhuman reaction speed, the sword monstress curled her head away. However, the air pressure grazed her shoulder, causing her body to twirl backward. Bang! The sword monstress shot tens of meters backward, crashing into the walls of the tower. All those standing in the area shot away, unwilling to get in Jianghu's way. The sound of dripping blood sounded once the tower fell into another silence. At that moment, everyone saw the same thing. The side of the sword monstress cloak was torn away, revealing a now bloodied shoulder. However, what was the most shocking was that this sword monstress' so-called hunched back was actually a massive, oddly curved package larger than even the sword monstress herself. With much of the cloak ripped away, it was easier to estimate the sword monstress' true size. In fact, she looked like quite a petite young lady. And with the way her black hair fell over her face, she even seemed somewhat enticing. However, those thoughts of curiosity all vanished when the sword monstress raised her head. In all their years, they had never seen such a grotesque sight. A ghastly infection ran across her face like the trenches of a muddy war. The scars were so inflamed that they even somewhat covered the portions of her face that hadn't been run across by them. Colors of green, purple and even gross brown ran across them all. It all reflected beneath the light in a way that made the skin of all those who saw it crawl. It's you. Jianghu's gaze blazed. The sword monstress used her sword as a crutch and pushed herself up. Under the gazes of everyone present, the wound to her shoulder rapidly healed. In the blink of an eye, other than the blood that still ran over her skin, it seemed as though she had never been injured at all. Jianghu's pupils constricted. She remembered this ability, but it was even more potent than it had been in the past. Unfortunately, it wouldn't matter. A dead person couldn't heal. The sword monstress walked forward with an indifferent expression. The cloak she wore had nothing to do with a will to hide her face. If it was about this, she would wear a mask instead. Rather, the cloak was a convenient way to hide the curved box on her back. This was what she wanted to hide. But, since it was out in the open already, it didn't matter much anymore. Since she had already made it to Brave City and the third phase was about to begin, keeping it hidden no longer mattered. Jilnia's gaze flashed with a cold light. At that moment, though, a person suddenly rushed into the tower's first floor. In such a silent environment, especially when everyone had already arrived early, such an arrival caught the attention of many. Even Jilnia couldn't help but spare a glance. A young man with handsome and sharp features shot inside, a wide grin on his face when he noticed the time hadn't quite hit 0 just yet. The young man seemed to be in a great mood. But, with his sharp senses, he seemed to realize that something was off about the atmosphere. After scanning the area, his gaze landed on 2 young women. The young man's eyes widened. Aina. The young man's expression suddenly changed. Any words he was going to say were cut off, his mind going blank. Those who spoke about the details of this day in the future would remember it as the day they felt the most fear they ever had in their lifetimes. Each and every person present felt as though their hearts had been gripped by a reaper, like bone-cold waters had been poured into their veins, traveling through their bodies and leaving them completely paralyzed. Out of her own control, Jilnia's body shot backward at the fastest speed she could muster, her heart thumping so hard that it felt like it might fly from her chest at any moment. The young man vanished, appearing before the sword monstress in the blink of an eye. Only a rare few could even see how he moved, and even those who could felt as though he had become nothing but a streak of gold light. He stood before the sword monstress, his eyes blazing. In that instant, several collapsed to the ground, their visions turning black. The pressure was so suffocating that even many who managed to maintain their consciousness fell to their knees, tears of fear falling from their eyes. Who did this to you? I'll kill them all. A palpable aura surged out like a sea of blood, enveloping the tower's first floor. The young man's voice boomed, causing the air to quake and tremble beneath his rage. For the first time, there was a ripple in the sword monstress gaze. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.